Carl Jung, explained, 8 spiritual reasons you're always the one who pulls away. The great wheel of human connection turns upon a paradox older than memory itself. We withdraw precisely when our souls most hunger for union, retreat exactly when our hearts cry out for recognition. This is not the failure of love, but its most sacred mystery, the first movement in an eternal dance choreographed by forces that move beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. When you pull away first, you are not acting from cowardice, but from an ancient wisdom that knows the terrible beauty of what approaches. For intimacy is not merely the meeting of 2 bodies or even 2 minds. It is the collision of 2 entire universes, each carrying within it the accumulated weight of every wound, every fear, every buried longing that has shaped the contours of a human life. The unconscious recognizes what the conscious mind cannot yet bear to acknowledge, that to love and be loved fully requires nothing less than the complete dissolution of everything we have constructed to keep ourselves safe. Every relationship becomes a mirror held up to the face of the soul, reflecting back not only who we are but who we might become if we possess the courage to step beyond the familiar boundaries of our carefully guarded existence. This is why the body knows to freeze, why the nervous system floods with the ancient chemicals of flight, why every cell suddenly screams the warning that has echoed through countless generations. Danger approaches, but the danger is not the other person. It is the prospect of our own awakening, the terrifying possibility that we might finally be seen and known in our entirety. Jung understood that this threshold moment, this pause before intimacy, is where the real work of individuation begins. For here, suspended between approach and retreat, we encounter the first of the great guardians that protect the treasure of our authentic self. This guardian appears wearing the mask of self-preservation, speaking in the voice of reason, offering what seems like the wisdom of caution. Turn back, it whispers with the authority of every disappointment we have ever endured. Remember how it felt the last time you allowed yourself to be vulnerable. Remember the sting of rejection, the ache of abandonment, the hollow echo of promises broken in the darkness of human frailty. Why risk that pain again when you could remain safe in the fortress of your solitude? But those who would know themselves, truly know themselves, must learn to recognize this voice not as wisdom, but as fear wearing the disguise of protection. The threshold guardian is not our enemy. It is the loyal servant of an outdated system of survival, a mechanism perfectly designed for a world where emotional vulnerability meant literal death, where the tribe's rejection could leave us exposed to predators both seen and unseen. In the landscape of the modern heart, these ancient protective mechanisms become the very prisons that keep us from the connection our souls desperately crave. We have inherited the nervous system of ancestors who needed to scan constantly for threats, to maintain perpetual vigilance against the possibility of rejection or abandonment. But in our contemporary world of emotional complexity, these same mechanisms often fire false alarms, mistaking love's approach for danger, interpreting another's genuine interest as a threat to be neutralized through preemptive withdrawal. The dance of intimacy, then, begins with this recognition that our impulse to pull away is not a sign of our unworthiness for love, but evidence of love's tremendous power to transform us. We retreat because some part of us, wiser than our everyday consciousness, knows that to move forward means to step into a process of becoming that cannot be controlled, predicted, or undone. Every genuine encounter with another human being carries within it the seeds of our own death and rebirth, not the death of the body, but the death of the limited identity we have mistaken for our true self. When we withdraw from intimacy, we are often protecting this false self from the fate it must eventually meet, the dissolution that precedes authentic becoming. This is the first great paradox of human connection. We must die to live, surrender to win, empty ourselves to be filled. The threshold guardian knows this and offers what appears to be mercy, the chance to avoid the inevitable crucifixion of the ego that love demands. But this mercy is false, for it preserves only what was never real in the first place, while denying us access to the authentic self that waits beyond the guardian's protective embrace. In the depths of the unconscious, ancient patterns stir like creatures awakening from long hibernation. The abandoned child within us begins to weep, remembering every time we reached out only to find empty air, every moment we offered our hearts only to watch them returned, wounded and bleeding. The rejected lover emerges from the shadows of memory, carrying the accumulated weight of every no we have ever received, every door that closed in our face, every silence that stretched too long in the space where acceptance should have lived. These inner figures gather like a council of fear, each offering testimony about the dangers of opening our hearts again. They speak with the authority of experience, these wounded aspects of ourselves, and their words carry the weight of genuine pain. They do not lie when they remind us how much it hurts to be rejected, how devastating it feels to be seen and found wanting, how the echo of emotional abandonment can reverberate through the chambers of the heart for years. Yet Jung's profound insight illuminates the hidden truth that lives beneath this protective chorus. These wounded aspects of ourselves are not seeking to prevent our healing. They are crying out for it. The abandoned child does not want us to remain forever isolated. It wants to finally experience the security of genuine acceptance. The rejected lover does not wish us eternal solitude. It longs to discover that we are worthy of the love it has been seeking all along. When we pull away first, we believe we are sparing these vulnerable parts of ourselves additional pain. But in truth, we are condemning them to remain forever frozen in their original wounds, never given the chance to experience the healing that only genuine intimacy can provide. We think we are protecting them, but we are actually imprisoning them in the very experiences we most want them to transcend. The threshold guardian's greatest weapon is the illusion that we can remain unchanged. It whispers the seductive lie that we can experience love without being transformed by it, that we can know another deeply without allowing ourselves to be known in return, that we can maintain perfect control over our emotional lives while still accessing the profound gifts that only vulnerability can unlock. But the unconscious knows what the ego refuses to acknowledge, that growth happens only at the edges of our comfort zones, that healing occurs only in the presence of what we have been avoiding, that the very experiences we most fear often contain the medicine our souls most desperately need. The impulse to withdraw is not random. It arises precisely in those moments when we are closest to a breakthrough, when the possibility of genuine transformation hovers like a bird of paradise just beyond our reach. This is why the timing of our retreat often seems so cruelly perfect, so exquisitely calibrated to sabotage our happiness. We meet someone who sees us clearly and appreciates what they find, and suddenly every alarm bell in our nervous system begins to ring. We encounter a love that feels safe and nourishing, and immediately our mind floods with reasons why it cannot last, why it must be too good to be true, why we should escape before the inevitable disappointment arrives. The threshold guardian does not operate according to the logic of the conscious mind. It measures threat not by what is happening in the present moment, but by what happened in the past, not by the reality of who stands before us, but by the ghosts of everyone who ever left us standing alone. It cannot distinguish between the person who truly sees us now and the parent who was too wounded to offer the love we needed. between the partner who genuinely appreciates our authentic self and the ex-lover who rejected us for reasons we may never understand. In the realm of the unconscious, all rejections become one rejection. All abandonments echo the primal abandonment. All losses resurrect the original loss that taught us the world was not safe for our tender hearts. The threshold guardian rises from this ancient soil of pain, armed with the accumulated wisdom of every wound we have ever carried, every scar that has taught us the price of vulnerability. Yet the guardian's protection, however well-intentioned, becomes a prison when it prevents us from recognizing that not every approach is an attack. Not every invitation to intimacy is a prelude to abandonment. Not every person who sees us clearly will inevitably find us lacking. The very mechanisms that once preserved our psychological survival now threaten to starve us of the connection we need to truly live. The great work of individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are, requires that we learn to dance with this guardian rather than be controlled by it. This does not mean ignoring its warnings or pretending that the dangers it perceives are never real. Some people truly are not safe for our hearts. Some situations genuinely do require the protective wisdom of withdrawal. The art lies in learning to discern when the guardian speaks from present wisdom and when it echoes only the phantoms of the past. This discernment cannot be achieved through the rational mind alone, for the threshold guardian operates from layers of consciousness that predate language and logic. It speaks in the ancient tongue of sensation and image, of cellular memory and inherited trauma. To commune with it effectively, we must descend into our own depths, must learn to navigate the shadowy territories where our most fundamental fears and longings make their home. The guardian tests every potential lover, every friendship, every invitation to deeper connection. It watches for the signs it has learned to associate with danger. Too much interest too quickly, expressions of care that feel overwhelming, invitations to vulnerability that trigger the memory of past betrayals. It measures every gesture against the template of previous wounds, looking for evidence that this person, like all the others, will eventually reveal themselves to be untrustworthy. But the guardian's tests are not neutral observations. They are active provocations. In its desperate attempt to confirm its worst fears, it often creates the very scenarios it seeks to prevent. We pull away so abruptly that we confuse and hurt the very person whose interest we found threatening. We retreat so completely that we leave them standing bewildered in the wake of our sudden absence, wondering what they did wrong, why their genuine expression of care was met with such inexplicable withdrawal. In this way, the guardian becomes a kind of unconscious prophet, creating the rejections it predicts, manifesting the abandonments it fears. It points to the confusion and hurt in the other person's eyes as evidence of its prophetic accuracy, proof that its warnings were justified. See? It whispers with grim satisfaction. I told you they would leave. I told you they would hurt you. I was only trying to protect you. But the guardian's supposed victories are hollow, for they preserve only the familiar landscape of isolation while denying us access to the unknown territories where healing and growth await. Each successful retreat strengthens the guardian's conviction that withdrawal is the only safe response to love's approach, creating a feedback loop that becomes increasingly difficult to break as the years accumulate their weight of missed connections and abandoned possibilities. The path through the guardian's domain requires tremendous courage, not the courage to ignore danger, but the courage to feel our fear fully while refusing to be controlled by it. It demands that we learn to sit with the tremendous discomfort that arises when someone begins to see us clearly, to breathe through the panic that floods our nervous system when genuine care approaches, to remain present even when every cell in our body screams the ancient warning to run. This is the threshold where heroes are born, where the journey of true individuation begins. For those who would know love, both giving and receiving, must first face the guardian that stands between them and their own capacity for connection. They must learn to recognize the voice of protection masquerading as wisdom, to distinguish between the genuine dangers of the present and the echoes of past wounds that no longer serve their growth. The guardian will not simply step aside because we have recognized its presence. It has stood watch for too long, has seen too much evidence of the world's capacity to wound, has accumulated too many scars in its faithful service to our survival. It must be met with respect, acknowledged for its years of protective service, honored for the genuine care that motivates its vigilance. But it must also be shown a larger vision, a more expansive understanding of what safety truly means. For the guardian's definition of safety, perfect protection from all possibility of hurt, is actually a form of death, a slow starvation of the very connections that give life meaning. True safety lies not in the absence of risk, but in the development of our capacity to navigate risk with wisdom and grace. This is the great paradox that the threshold guardian embodies. It arises to protect our capacity for love, but often becomes the very force that prevents us from accessing that capacity. It guards the treasure of our authentic self so carefully that neither we nor anyone else can reach it. In its determination to prevent our hearts from being broken, it often succeeds only in ensuring that they remain closed. The dance of intimacy begins here, at this precise moment of recognition, when we feel the familiar urge to retreat and choose, instead, to pause. Not to force ourselves forward before we are ready, not to override our protective mechanisms with sheer will, but to create a sacred space between stimulus and response, between the approach of love and our automatic reaction to it. In this pause, we can begin to hear the guardian's voice more clearly, to understand the fears that drive its protective instincts, to appreciate the genuine care that motivates its vigilance. We can begin to sense what lies beyond its protective embrace, the authentic self that waits patiently for the chance to be known, the capacity for connection that has never been damaged despite all our wounds, the love that remains whole and available even in the aftermath of every rejection we have ever endured. The threshold guardian is not our enemy, it is our teacher, showing us precisely where our work lies, illuminating the exact places where our growth waits to unfold. Its presence marks the boundary between who we have been and who we are becoming, between the safety of the known and the mystery of what we might discover on the other side of our fear. The mask we wear in the theater of daily life is a masterpiece of unconscious artistry, crafted over decades of careful observation and meticulous adjustment. Every smile perfectly calibrated, every gesture rehearsed in the mirror of social expectation, every word chosen to maintain the delicate equilibrium between revelation and concealment. This is the persona, not merely a disguise, but a living monument to our terror of being truly seen. When genuine intimacy approaches like the first light of dawn penetrating a carefully shuttered room, the persona recognizes its mortal enemy, for authentic love demands nothing less than the complete dismantling of this elaborate construction, the stripping away of every protective layer until nothing remains but the trembling truth of who we actually are beneath all our careful presentations. The persona has spent a lifetime learning the precise angles of our face that photograph best, the exact tone of voice that commands respect, the particular brand of humor that deflects serious inquiry into our deeper nature. It knows which stories to tell at dinner parties to ensure we appear interesting but not overwhelming, which vulnerabilities to reveal to seem authentic, while keeping our true fragilities safely hidden, which aspects of our personality to emphasize in different social contexts to maximize our chances of acceptance and minimize our risk of rejection. This carefully constructed identity becomes so seamless, so integral to our daily navigation of the world, that we often forget it is a construction at all. We mistake the persona for our authentic self, believing that the smooth, socially acceptable version we present to the world represents the totality of who we are. The mask becomes so comfortable, so familiar, that we cannot imagine existing without it. But the unconscious knows the difference between performance and authenticity, between the self we have learned to be and the self we truly are. Deep in the basement of awareness, our authentic nature waits with the patience of stone, watching as we exhaust ourselves, maintaining an identity that requires constant vigilance, perpetual adjustment, endless performance to sustain its believability. When someone approaches with the genuine intention of knowing us, not the carefully edited version we are, present, but the complex, contradictory, beautifully human creature that lives beneath our social veneer, the persona sounds every alarm in its considerable arsenal. It recognizes that this person's interest threatens not just our current identity, but the entire system of protection we have built around our vulnerability. The persona whispers its urgent warnings. They don't want to see you cry at random moments for reasons you can't explain. They don't want to know about the jealousy that sometimes consumes you, the petty resentments you harbor, the secret fears that wake you at 3 a.m, drenched in inexplicable dread. They don't want to discover that you talk to yourself in the mirror, that you still sleep with a childhood stuffed animal, that you sometimes feel overwhelmed by a loneliness so profound it takes your breath away. They are attracted to the version of you that has everything together. The persona continues with the authority of long experience, the confident, capable, emotionally stable person you have shown them. If they see the real you, the one who sometimes can't get out of bed, who eats ice cream for breakfast when life feels unmanageable, who carries conversations with people who hurt you years ago, who still doesn't know what you want to be when you grow up, they will recognize their mistake and quietly disappear. The persona's logic seems unassailable because it is built on a foundation of genuine observation. We have all witnessed the moment when someone's interest visibly dims after glimpsing something real beneath our social presentation. We have all experienced the subtle but unmistakable shift in energy when we revealed too much too soon, when our authentic emotions proved too intense for someone expecting the sanitized version of human feeling. These experiences teach the persona that its vigilance is not paranoia but wisdom, that its protective mechanisms are not obstacles to love but necessary conditions for maintaining any connection at all. Better to be loved for who we pretend to be than rejected for who we actually are. It reasons. Better to maintain relationships at a safe distance than risk the annihilation that comes with being truly seen and found wanting. But Jung's revolutionary insight reveals the fatal flaw in the persona's protective strategy. By preventing others from seeing our authentic nature, we also prevent ourselves from discovering that we are worthy of love exactly as we are. The persona's protection becomes a prison that keeps out not only potential rejection but also potential acceptance, not only possible hurt but also possible healing. The mask we wear so skillfully begins to suffocate us. We find ourselves exhausted by the constant performance, depleted by the endless vigilance required to maintain our carefully constructed image. We lose touch with our own desires, our genuine preferences, our authentic responses to life's experiences. We become so skilled at being who others want us to be that we forget who we wanted to be, so adept at performing acceptability that we can no longer recognize our own voice beneath the chorus of social expectations. The persona's last stand occurs precisely in those moments when someone expresses genuine interest in moving beyond surface pleasantries into deeper territory. Their invitation to authenticity triggers every defense mechanism the persona has developed over decades of careful refinement. Suddenly, the person who seemed so comfortable in their own skin becomes evasive. The one who appeared confident and self-assured begins to create distance. The individual who projected such openness starts building walls. This is not hypocrisy, but terror. The terror of discovering that our authentic self might not be acceptable, that the love offered to our persona might evaporate when confronted with our unedited reality. The persona has become so convinced of our essential unlovability that it cannot imagine anyone choosing to stay once they see beneath the surface of our presentation. We pull away not because we don't want intimacy, but because we want it so desperately that the thought of losing it becomes unbearable. The persona calculates that maintaining connection at a surface level is preferable to risking the total loss that might come with deeper revelation. It chooses the guaranteed loneliness of being unknown over the possible devastation of being known and rejected. But the persona's calculations are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of love's nature. It assumes that love is primarily aesthetic, that people choose to stay or leave based on their evaluation of our worthiness according to external criteria. It cannot comprehend that genuine love often arises not despite our flaws and struggles, but because of the courage it takes to be human in all our imperfect complexity. The persona has studied love like a foreign language, memorizing its vocabulary without understanding its grammar. It knows how to say, "I love you," but cannot fathom what it means to be loved. It can perform the gestures of intimacy while remaining fundamentally isolated behind the wall of its own construction. This isolation becomes most acute in those relationships where someone is genuinely trying to know us. The more they express authentic interest in our inner world, the more frantically the persona works to maintain its protective distance. We find ourselves becoming increasingly unavailable emotionally, even as we continue to go through the motions of connection. We are physically present but psychologically absent, offering the form of intimacy while withholding its substance. The persona's resistance to being known often manifests as a kind of emotional sleight of hand. We reveal carefully selected vulnerabilities while keeping our deeper fears hidden. We share calculated imperfections while protecting our most tender wounds. We offer the appearance of openness while maintaining essential barriers to genuine knowledge. We become skilled at giving just enough to satisfy the other person's desire for authenticity while keeping our core self safely locked away. This strategy works until it doesn't. Eventually, the person trying to love us begins to sense the careful calculation behind our revelations, the way we portion out our authenticity like medicine in measured doses. They feel the presence of walls they cannot name, the sense that they are being held at a distance that remains constant regardless of how much trust they demonstrate, how much acceptance they offer, how much love they express. The persona tells us this growing distance is proof of its wisdom. See how they pull away when they sense our resistance. This confirms that our authentic self would indeed be rejected if fully revealed. But the persona cannot see that it has created the very scenario it sought to prevent. By withholding our genuine self, we force others to relate to a hollow version of who we are, leaving them feeling unsatisfied and disconnected despite their best efforts to create meaningful contact. The tragedy of the persona's last stand is that it often succeeds in preserving the very isolation it was designed to prevent. In its determination to avoid rejection, It creates a situation where genuine acceptance becomes impossible. By refusing to risk being known, it ensures that we remain fundamentally alone, even in the presence of those who would love us if given the chance. Jung understood that the persona's death is not destruction, but liberation, the shedding of a skin that has become too small for the growing soul. The authentic self that emerges when the persona finally yields its protective control is not the damaged, unworthy creature we feared to reveal, but a being of surprising resilience and unexpected beauty. The dismantling of the persona happens not through violence, but through exhaustion. Eventually, the energy required to maintain our carefully constructed image exceeds our capacity to sustain the performance. We find ourselves too tired to remember which version of ourselves we were supposed to be in which situation, too depleted to maintain the constant vigilance that keeping up appearances demands. In these moments of persona fatigue, cracks begin to appear in our social presentation. Our authentic emotions leak through the gaps, a flash of genuine anger, a moment of unguarded joy, a tear that falls before we can catch it and explain it away. These inadvertent revelations terrify the persona, which interprets them as evidence of its failing defenses, proof that our protective systems are breaking down. But these moments of unintended authenticity often produce the opposite effect from what the persona predicts. Instead of driving people away, they frequently draw others closer. There is something magnetic about genuine human emotion, something compelling about the sight of a real person emerging from behind their social mask. Others recognize something familiar in these moments, the echo of their own hidden struggles, the reflection of their own carefully concealed humanity. The persona cannot understand this response because it has never allowed itself to witness the full cycle of vulnerability and acceptance. It knows intimately the terror of potential rejection, but it has never remained present long enough to discover what lies on the other side of that fear. It pulls back before the miracle of acceptance can occur, retreats before the healing of genuine recognition can take place. The death of the persona is not a single event, but a gradual process of letting go, a slow release of the need to control how we are perceived and received. It requires the development of what Jung called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to be seen as we are rather than as we think others want us to be, the strength to offer our authentic presence even when we cannot guarantee it will be welcomed. This courage does not arise from confidence, but from desperation, the recognition that the alternative to authenticity is not safety but a kind of living death, a gradual disappearance of ourselves into the very masks we created for protection. The persona's last stand becomes, paradoxically, the moment when we realize we have more to fear from remaining hidden than from being seen. In the end, the persona's death reveals not weakness, but strength, not the fragile creature we feared to expose, but the resilient being who has survived everything life has offered and still retains the capacity to love and be loved. The authentic self that emerges from the persona's protective embrace carries within it all the wisdom earned through struggle, all the compassion developed through suffering, all the depth created through the courageous act of being human in an uncertain world. The person who feared we would abandon them when we saw their truth discovers instead that we are drawn to their authenticity like plants turning toward the sun. For in a world full of carefully constructed personas, there is nothing more precious than the gift of genuine human presence, nothing more healing than the sight of someone brave enough to be exactly who they are. In the basement of consciousness, beneath the floorboards of our carefully maintained self-image, something stirs in the darkness. It moves with the weight of everything we have refused to acknowledge, everything we have banished from the light of our awareness, everything we have deemed too dangerous or too shameful to integrate into our understanding of who we are. This is the shadow, not evil, not malevolent, but simply unloved, unacknowledged, unfed by the nourishment of our conscious attention. When we withdraw from love's approach, we are often acting not from our own fear, but from the shadow's ancient terror of exposure. For the shadow carries within it not only our repressed darkness, but also our disowned light, the parts of ourselves we have learned to hide because they were once met with punishment, ridicule, or abandonment. In the shadow's realm, our greatest gifts often lie entangled with our deepest wounds, our most authentic nature twisted into shapes of shame by the cruel geometry of early rejection. The shadow whispers its poison with the voice of every authority figure who ever made us feel small. If they truly knew you, they would run. If they could see what you carry in your secret places, they would understand their mistake. You are not worthy of the love they offer. You are only skilled at hiding your unworthiness long enough to fool them into caring. This is the shadow's great lie, so convincing because it is built on fragments of truth. We do carry darkness within us, moments of cruelty, flashes of hatred, impulses toward destruction that shock us with their intensity. We have all felt the stirring of emotions we judge as unacceptable, the satisfaction that accompanies another's failure, the rage that wishes harm to those who have hurt us, the desperate hunger that would consume everything in its path if given permission. But the shadow's cruelest trick is not in making us believe we possess these qualities. It is in convincing us that possessing them makes us unworthy of love. The shadow has internalized not only our rejected impulses, but also the rejecting voice that deemed them unacceptable in the first place. It becomes both criminal and judge, both the condemned and the condemner, trapped in an endless loop of self-persecution that grows stronger with each act of concealment. In childhood, we learn to read the subtle signs of adult disapproval, like weather patterns, adjusting our behavior to avoid the storms of rejection or punishment. The part of us that felt intense anger was banished to the shadow when we discovered it made the adults uncomfortable. The aspect that experienced overwhelming sadness was hidden away when we learned that our tears were inconvenient or embarrassing. The piece that felt wild joy was suppressed when we realized it was too much, too loud, too disruptive of the carefully maintained order. But the shadow collected more than just our difficult emotions. It also gathered the parts of us that were too bright, too creative, too authentic for the environments we found ourselves navigating. The child who saw beauty everywhere was sent to the shadow when their wonder was dismissed as naive. The adolescent who felt everything deeply was banished to darkness when their intensity was labeled as too much. The young adult who dreamed impossible dreams was hidden away when those dreams were met with practical concerns about security and respectability. Over time, the shadow became a repository not just for what we judged as bad about ourselves, but for everything that was too real, too alive, too threatening to the stability of our carefully constructed personas. It holds our capacity for rage and our ability to feel deeply, our selfish impulses and our profound generosity, our darkness and our light, all tangled together in a knot of shame that grows tighter with each year of concealment. When someone approaches with genuine interest in knowing us completely, the shadow panics. It knows that real intimacy involves not just the sharing of our light, but the acknowledgement of our darkness. It understands that true love requires the integration of all aspects of our being, the parts we celebrate and the parts we despise, the qualities we're proud of and the impulses we wish we could excise from our nature entirely. The shadow has spent decades perfecting its hiding place, learning to operate in the spaces between our conscious thoughts, influencing our behavior through channels we don't recognize or acknowledge. It manifests in the cutting remark that surprises us with its cruelty, the moment of jealousy that consumes us with its intensity, the flash of hatred that scares us with its power. Then, ashamed of these eruptions from the unconscious, we redouble our efforts to keep the shadow contained, to present only the acceptable aspects of our nature to the world. This creates a vicious cycle. The more we reject our shadow, the more it operates outside our conscious control. The more it acts without our awareness, the more ashamed we become of its influence. The more ashamed we become, the more desperately we try to hide it from others. The more we hide it, the more isolated we become, convinced that we are uniquely flawed, uniquely unworthy of the love that seems to come so easily to others who appear more integrated, more whole, more deserving. The shadow's secret shame is not actually about the darkness it contains. It is about the isolation that darkness has created. The shadow suffers not from being evil, but from being unloved, not from being wrong, but from being alone with its pain. It carries the accumulated weight of every time we turned away from ourselves in disgust, every moment we chose rejection over integration, every instance where we decided that some part of us was too dangerous to acknowledge, too shameful to accept, too damaged to heal. When love approaches, the shadow does not fear the other person. It fears what will happen when our own self-rejection is exposed. It knows that we have not learned to love ourselves completely, that we still turn away in horror from certain aspects of our own nature. How can we allow another to love what we ourselves have deemed unlovable? How can we accept their acceptance when we have not yet learned to offer acceptance to ourselves? The shadow's withdrawal from intimacy is actually a twisted form of self-protection. It reasons that if we leave before we are discovered, we spare ourselves the devastating experience of being rejected for who we truly are. Better to be left for our surface presentation than abandoned for our authentic nature. Better to maintain the illusion that we could be loved if we chose to reveal ourselves than to risk discovering that even our deepest truth is not enough to earn the love we crave. But the shadow's calculations are based on the assumption that love operates according to the logic of judgment, that others will evaluate our worthiness according to some cosmic scale of acceptability and find us wanting. It cannot conceive of a love that embraces contradiction, that finds beauty in brokenness, that recognizes the profound humanity in our struggles with our own darkness. The shadow has never experienced what Jung called the transcendent function, the mysterious alchemy that occurs when two opposite aspects of our nature are held in conscious tension long enough for a new synthesis to emerge. It knows only the warfare between light and dark, good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable. It cannot imagine the possibility of integration, the healing that comes when we learn to love ourselves, not despite our flaws, but including them, not in spite of our complexity, but because of it. In the shadow's realm, every emotion becomes evidence of our fundamental unworthiness. Anger proves we are dangerous. Sadness demonstrates we are broken. Fear reveals we are weak. Jealousy shows we are small. Desire exposes us as selfish. The shadow has learned to interpret every feeling as a flaw, every impulse as a failing, every natural human response as proof of our essential defectiveness. But Jung's revolutionary insight reveals that the shadow contains not only our rejected darkness, but also our disowned gold, the aspects of ourselves that were too bright, too powerful, too authentic for the environments that shaped our early development. In the shadow live not only the parts of us that we judge as bad, but also the parts we judge as too good, too intense, too threatening to the carefully maintained equilibrium of our social world. The shadow holds our capacity for righteous anger at injustice, our ability to feel grief that honors the magnitude of loss, Our strength to stand alone when standing with others would require betraying our values. It contains our wild creativity, our untamed passion, our fierce loyalty, our profound sensitivity, all banished to darkness because they were once deemed too much for the people around us to handle. When we withdraw from love, we are often protecting not only our shame, but also our beauty, the radiant aspects of ourselves that we have learned to hide because their full expression once brought punishment or abandonment. We fear that our authentic joy might overwhelm others, that our genuine love might be too intense, that our real passion might burn too brightly for comfort. The shadow's secret shame includes the shame of our own magnificence, the guilt of possessing gifts that others might envy, the fear that our full expression might threaten the carefully maintained balance of our relationships. We learn to dim our light not only to avoid standing out as different, but also to avoid the complex dynamics that arise when we shine too brightly in environments that have grown accustomed to our diminished presence. This creates a particular form of suffering. We punish ourselves not only for our failures, but also for our successes, not only for our darkness, but also for our light. The shadow becomes a prison that contains everything we are, leaving us with only a narrow band of acceptable expression that grows more constrained with each passing year. When genuine intimacy approaches, the shadow recognizes that this person might want to see all of us, not just the carefully curated version we present to the world, but the full spectrum of our humanity. They might want to witness our rage and our tenderness, our pettiness and our generosity, our fear and our courage. They might want to love us not in spite of our complexity, but because of it. Not despite our contradictions, but including them. This possibility terrifies the shadow because it has never experienced unconditional acceptance. It has known only the conditional love that says, I will love you if you are good, if you are strong, if you are happy, if you cause no problems, if you make me comfortable. The shadow cannot imagine a love that says, I will love you because you are human, because you struggle, because you carry both light and darkness, because you are courageously willing to be imperfect in an imperfect world. The shadow's withdrawal from intimacy often takes the form of what Jung called projection. We attribute to others the rejection we expect to receive, seeing in their eyes the disgust we feel toward ourselves, hearing in their voices the criticism that echoes constantly in our own minds. We pull away from love because we are convinced the other person will eventually see what we see when we look in the mirror, a creature too flawed for unconditional acceptance, too damaged for genuine love. But the shadow's projections reveal more about our relationship with ourselves than about the reality of how others perceive us. When we assume others will reject us, we are often rejecting ourselves. When we fear their judgment, we are usually hearing the voice of our own inner critic. When we expect their abandonment, we are typically abandoning ourselves in the ways we learned to abandon ourselves long ago. The healing of the shadow begins not with the elimination of our darkness, but with the recognition that our darkness, like our light, deserves compassion. The parts of us we have banished to the basement of consciousness are not evil entities to be destroyed, but wounded children to be embraced, not demons to be exorcised, but aspects of ourselves to be integrated into the wholeness of our being. Jung understood that the goal of individuation is not to become perfect, but to become whole, to acknowledge and integrate all aspects of our nature into a conscious relationship with ourselves. This requires the courage to descend into the shadow's realm, to face what we have been avoiding, to extend love to the parts of ourselves we have learned to hate. This process cannot be accomplished alone. The shadow's healing requires witness, requires the presence of another who can see our darkness without turning away, who can acknowledge our struggles without demanding we fix them immediately, who can love us not despite our imperfections, but including them as part of what makes us beautifully, courageously human. When we find the courage to reveal our shadow to another, not dramatically or self-indulgently, but with the simple honesty of someone tired of carrying secrets, we often discover that our worst fears were fantasies. The person who sees our jealousy does not recoil in horror, but recognizes the fear beneath it. The one who witnesses our anger does not flee, but understands the pain that fuels it. The individual who encounters our selfishness does not condemn, but sees the unmet needs that drive it. This is not to say that all people are capable of this level of acceptance, or that everyone we meet will have the emotional capacity to hold space for our full humanity. Part of the shadow work involves learning to discern who is ready for our authenticity and who is not, who has done their own shadow work sufficiently to recognize the universal nature of human darkness and who is still too afraid of their own rejected aspects to welcome ours. But the miracle of shadow integration is that once we learn to love ourselves completely, including the parts we judge as unacceptable, we become capable of offering that same complete love to others. We recognize in their struggles the echo of our own, see in their imperfections the reflection of our shared humanity, understand that their capacity to love us fully depends not on our perfection, but on our willingness to be authentically ourselves. The shadow's secret shame dissolves not through exposure, but through integration, not through confession, but through acceptance. When we learn to hold our own darkness with compassion, we discover that it transforms from a source of shame into a source of strength, from evidence of our unworthiness into proof of our humanity. In the end, the shadow teaches us that withdrawal from love is often withdrawal from ourselves, from the fullness of who we are, from the complexity that makes us real, from the contradictions that make us interesting. To love another completely, we must first learn to love ourselves completely. To be loved for who we truly are, we must first accept who we truly are. The shadow's greatest gift is not the darkness it protects, but the integration it makes possible, the wholeness that emerges when we stop running from ourselves and learn, instead, to embrace the full spectrum of our humanity with the tender compassion we would offer to any wounded creature seeking love. In the deepest chambers of the psyche, where shadows dance with forgotten dreams and wounded memories crystallize into protective armor, there dwells a figure both sacred and scarred, the anima, that feminine principle within every soul that holds our capacity for receptivity, for the tender opening that allows love to enter and transform us. She is the keeper of our emotional depths, the guardian of our intuitive wisdom, the bridge between the conscious mind and the vast unconscious sea that connects us to all life. Yet in so many of us she has become a wounded oracle, speaking not of love's possibilities but of its inevitable betrayals, whispering warnings born from the ashes of past devastation. Listen carefully, for her lament echoes through the corridors of every heart that has learned to retreat just as intimacy beckons. Every soul that pulls away not from lack of desire, but from an excess of memory, an abundance of pain that has taught the deepest parts of ourselves that vulnerability is synonymous with destruction. The wounded anima does not withdraw from love out of malice or cruelty, but out of a desperate wisdom born from experience, a protective instinct that has learned through fire and loss that to open the heart is to invite its shattering. She remembers, you see, with the clarity of archived agony, every moment when tenderness was met with betrayal, when trust was rewarded with abandonment, when the soul's most precious offerings were trampled underfoot by those who promised sanctuary but delivered devastation instead. She has become the keeper of these memories, the archivist of emotional wounds, and from her underground palace of protective darkness, she influences every approach toward intimate connection with the hard-earned wisdom of survival. When we find ourselves inexplicably pulling away from someone whose presence promises healing, when we discover our hearts closing just as another soul approaches with genuine care, we are feeling the anima's protective influence, her ancient alarm system that has learned to recognize the signs of impending emotional danger before the conscious mind even knows what is happening. She has developed an exquisite sensitivity to the subtle cues that preceded past betrayals, the slight shift in tone that signals withdrawal, the change in energy that precedes abandonment, the 1,000 tiny indicators that love is about to transform into loss once again. But oh, how she aches in her protective isolation, this wounded feminine principle within us, for she knows that in shielding us from further harm, she also keeps us from the very nourishment our souls require to flourish. She is like a mother who has watched her child burned by fire and now refuses to allow any flame near, not understanding that without the hearth's warmth, the house will grow cold and lifeless. Her protection becomes a prison. Her wisdom becomes a wall that keeps out not only pain, but also the possibility of healing that can only come through renewed contact with love's transformative power. The cultural conditioning that has wounded so many animas runs deep as underground rivers, carrying toxic messages about the nature of feminine receptivity, emotional openness, and the supposed weakness of vulnerability. We have been taught to armor our hearts, to view sensitivity as liability, to transform our natural receptivity into suspicious vigilance. The anima learns to distrust her own impulses toward connection, to second-guess the very intuitions that once guided us toward nourishing relationships, to replace her organic wisdom with rigid rules designed to prevent any recurrence of past pain. In romantic relationships, the wounded anima manifests as that internal voice that whispers warnings just as intimacy deepens. This is when it happened before. This is when they left. This is when the promises turned to lies. She pulls the strings of our behavior from her underground chamber, creating elaborate strategies of emotional distance designed to maintain just enough connection to avoid complete loneliness, while ensuring just enough separation to prevent complete vulnerability. She teaches us the art of leaving before being left, of creating small betrayals to test loyalty, of building walls disguised as boundaries. Yet Jung understood, with the compassion of one who had wrestled with his own inner complexes, that the healing of the wounded anima cannot come through force or denial, but only through the patient work of re-education, the slow building of new evidence that challenges her trauma-based assumptions about the nature of love and intimacy. She must be approached not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a protective part of ourselves that has been trying in her limited understanding to keep us safe from further emotional devastation. This healing work requires us to become archaeologists of our own hearts, carefully excavating the original wounds that taught the anima her lessons of mistrust and withdrawal. We must understand not just what happened to wound her, but why these particular experiences created such lasting protective mechanisms. Often we discover that the anima's wounds correspond to moments when our natural receptivity was exploited, our emotional openness was punished, or our intuitive wisdom was dismissed or betrayed by those we trusted most deeply. The wounded anima in men often carries the collective wounds of masculine conditioning that taught them to fear their own emotional depths, to view receptivity as weakness, to armor themselves against the very sensitivity that would allow them to receive love fully. She becomes the internal critic that mocks any movement toward emotional openness, the voice that equates vulnerability with emasculation, the force that pulls them away from relationships just as they approach the threshold of genuine intimacy. In women, the wounded anima often carries the double burden of cultural messages that both demand emotional availability and punish it when it is offered authentically. She has learned that her natural receptivity can be exploited, that her emotional depth can be used against her, that her intuitive wisdom can be dismissed or pathologized. She develops elaborate systems of emotional self-protection that disguise themselves as strength but actually prevent the very connections that would restore her trust in love's possibilities. The re-education of the wounded anima begins with the recognition that her protective strategies, however limiting they may have become, arose from legitimate experiences of emotional trauma. We cannot simply override her warnings or dismiss her concerns as outdated, for to do so would be to inflict yet another wound upon this already injured part of ourselves. Instead, we must approach her with the patience of a skilled therapist, acknowledging the validity of her fears while gradually introducing new evidence that challenges her assumptions about love's inevitable trajectory. This process requires us to develop what Jung called a relationship with our own unconscious, learning to dialogue with the wounded parts of ourselves rather than simply being unconsciously influenced by their protective mechanisms. We must learn to recognize when the anima's voice of warning is speaking, to understand the specific triggers that activate her alarm systems, and to consciously choose whether her guidance serves our current reality or merely reflects the patterns of a wounded past. The healing also requires us to find safe relationships within which the anima can risk small experiments in trust, connections where her tentative offerings of vulnerability are met with respect, consistency, and genuine care. Like a wild animal that has been mistreated by humans, the wounded anima needs repeated experiences of safety before she will risk approaching intimacy without her elaborate armor of protection. She learns not through our reasoning with her, but through our providing her with new embodied experiences that contradict her trauma-based expectations. Sometimes the wounded anima's healing requires us to grieve the losses that created her protective stance in the first place, to finally feel the full weight of old betrayals, abandonments, and disappointments that were perhaps too overwhelming to process when they first occurred. The anima often carries not just our own wounds, but the collective wounds of our gender, our family lineage, and our cultural conditioning around love and intimacy. Her healing becomes part of a larger healing that extends beyond our individual psychology into the realm of collective repair. As the anima begins to heal, she does not lose her sensitivity or her capacity to recognize genuine danger. These remain essential aspects of her wisdom. Instead, she develops the ability to distinguish between past and present, between real threats and phantom fears, between protective strategies that serve our current growth and those that merely replay old patterns of avoidance and withdrawal. She becomes a guide toward healthy intimacy rather than an obstacle to all connection. The healed anima teaches us the art of receptivity without collapse, of openness without abandonment of self, of vulnerability as a form of strength rather than weakness. She shows us how to lower our defenses gradually, how to test new relationships for their capacity to hold our tender parts, how to extend trust in measured increments that honor both our need for connection and our hard-won wisdom about protecting our hearts from those who would misuse our openness. In the presence of someone who proves worthy of the anima's trust, someone who meets our vulnerability with their own, who honors our emotional depths without exploiting them, who demonstrates through consistent action their commitment to our well-being, she begins to relax her vigilant watch. She allows us to experience the full spectrum of intimate connection without the constant undertone of anticipated betrayal that once colored every interaction with suspicion and withdrawal. The wounded anima's lament gradually transforms into the healed anima's song, a melody that celebrates the courage required for authentic intimacy, the strength required for genuine vulnerability, and the wisdom that comes from learning to love again after love has wounded us. She becomes our guide into the depths of emotional connection, our teacher in the art of maintaining an open heart in a world that sometimes breaks hearts, our companion in the sacred work of allowing another soul to matter to us, despite all the risks such mattering entails. Yet even in her healing, the anima retains her role as protector, not the paranoid guardian who sees danger in every approach of love, but the wise counselor who helps us discern between connections that will nurture our growth and those that would recreate familiar patterns of wounding. She becomes our ally in the work of conscious relationship, helping us recognize when we are being called toward genuine intimacy and when we are being seduced by familiar dynamics that would ultimately leave us more wounded than before. The journey of healing the wounded anima is not a linear path, but a spiral dance, with moments of breakthrough followed by periods of protective withdrawal, times of courageous vulnerability alternating with episodes of familiar fear. She heals not all at once, but gradually, through repeated experiences of safety, consistency, and genuine care that slowly convince her that not all love leads to betrayal. Not all intimacy results in abandonment. Not all vulnerability invites exploitation. This healing work requires tremendous compassion for our own protective mechanisms, understanding that every wall we have built around our hearts was constructed in response to real danger. Every strategy of emotional withdrawal was developed in service of psychological survival. The wounded anima is not our enemy but our wounded healer, not our obstacle but our protector who simply needs new information about love's possibilities to update her ancient warnings. As we learn to honor both her protective wisdom and her deeper longing for connection, we begin to develop the capacity for what Jung called conscious relationship, intimacy that includes awareness of our own wounds and patterns, connection that honors both our need for autonomy and our desire for union, love that can hold the tension between our protective impulses and our yearning for transcendence through intimate meeting with another soul. The wounded anima's healing ultimately serves not just our individual capacity for love, but the collective healing of our cultural relationship to intimacy, vulnerability, and the sacred feminine principle that lives within every human heart. As we learn to approach our own wounded receptivity with compassion and patience, we contribute to a larger transformation in how our species learns to love without losing ourselves, to open without collapsing, to trust without abandoning discernment. In the end, the wounded anima's lament becomes a love song, not the naive melody of untested innocence, but the rich, complex harmony of a heart that has known loss and chosen love anyway, that has experienced betrayal and learned to trust again, that has been wounded by intimacy and yet still dares to believe in its healing power. She teaches us that true strength lies not in never being hurt, but in learning to love again after being hurt. Not in avoiding all risk, but in developing the wisdom to choose our risks consciously. The healed anima becomes our guide into the mystery of mature love, connection that includes shadow and light, intimacy that honors both merger and individuation, vulnerability that comes not from weakness, but from the deepest strength of a heart that has learned to trust its own capacity for healing and growth. She whispers new songs now, lullabies of possible love, ballads of conscious intimacy, hymns to the sacred courage required to keep our hearts open in a world that sometimes breaks hearts, but also, mysteriously, heals them through the very connections we once learned to fear. In the secret chambers of the adult heart, where sophisticated reasoning and mature understanding hold court over our daily decisions, there lives a child who never learned that the world was safe, who never experienced the fundamental trust that comes from knowing you are held, wanted, and protected by those whose love should have been as constant as breath itself. This orphaned aspect of our psyche carries within its small, wounded body the original blueprint of separation, that primal experience of aloneness that taught the developing soul that love is conditional, temporary, or simply unavailable when needed most desperately. When we pull away from intimate connection just as it begins to flourish, when we find ourselves creating distance precisely when our hearts are calling for closeness, we are often being guided by the survival wisdom of this inner orphan who learned in those early moments when the world should have felt like sanctuary that depending on no one is infinitely safer than risking the devastating pain of abandonment once again. The child's logic is heartbreakingly simple, elegantly tragic in its protective clarity. If I don't let them get too close, they can't hurt me the way I was hurt before. Listen closely to this child's story, for it is written in the language of survival, inscribed in the cellular memory of every moment when small hands reached out for comfort and found empty air, when tears fell without witness, when the fundamental need for attuned presence was met with absence, neglect, or the kind of conditional love that taught the developing psyche that affection must be earned through performance rather than simply received as birthright. The orphaned child within us learned to navigate a world where love felt scarce, unreliable, or dangerous, where the very people who should have provided safety became sources of unpredictability, where the arms that should have offered shelter became the instruments of further wounding, where the voices that should have whispered reassurance instead delivered criticism, abandonment, or the devastating silence of emotional unavailability. This child developed exquisite survival skills, learning to read the subtle signs that preceded withdrawal of love, becoming hyper-vigilant to any indication that care might be rescinded without warning. In the architecture of adult relationships, this orphaned aspect manifests as an internal alarm system that sounds its warnings whenever intimacy threatens to recreate the original conditions of dependency that once led to such profound disappointment. The child remembers, with the crystalline clarity of trauma, every moment when love was promised and then withdrawn, when security was offered and then revoked, when the ground beneath small feet proved to be nothing more than shifting sand that gave way at precisely the moment when solid ground was needed most. The protective mechanisms developed by this inner orphan are marvels of psychological adaptation, elaborate strategies designed to maintain just enough distance to prevent the recreation of original abandonment while preserving just enough connection to avoid complete isolation. The child learned to leave before being left, to create small tests of loyalty that inevitably lead to failure, to build walls disguised as independence that keep others at a safe distance from the tender core that once was so devastated by unmet need. Yet beneath this sophisticated armor of self-protection lies a soul that hungers for precisely what it fears most, the experience of being truly seen, known, and cherished, not for what it produces or how well it performs, but simply for existing. The orphaned child carries both the wound and the longing, both the terror of intimacy and the desperate need for the kind of connection that could finally heal the original. Separation that taught the psyche that love is not safe, not reliable, not something that can be trusted to endure. Jung understood, with the compassion born of his own encounters with the wounded child within, that this aspect of the psyche cannot be reasoned with, cannot be convinced through logical argument to abandon its protective strategies. The inner orphan learned its lessons, not through thought but through lived experience, through the accumulation of moments when trust was rewarded with betrayal, when vulnerability was met with exploitation, when the natural dependency of childhood was answered with abandonment rather than the consistent presence that would have taught the soul that love can be trusted. The healing of this orphaned aspect requires us to become the loving parent we never had, not through self-indulgence or regressive fantasy, but through the development of an internal capacity to provide ourselves with the consistent presence, unconditional acceptance, and protective care that the child needed but never received. This is not about blaming those who wounded us, for they too likely carried their own orphaned children, their own patterns of abandonment that prevented them from offering what they themselves had never received. The inner orphan often carries the wounds not just of our personal history, but of generational patterns of abandonment, cultural messages about love's reliability, and collective traumas that have taught entire communities that attachment is dangerous, that intimacy leads to loss, that the smart strategy is emotional self-sufficiency. The child within us holds these inherited fears alongside our personal experiences of disappointment, creating a complex tapestry of protection that can make authentic intimacy feel not just risky but impossible. In romantic relationships, the orphaned child manifests as the part of us that creates elaborate tests of loyalty, that pushes away precisely when we want to pull closer, that interprets normal human limitations as evidence of impending abandonment. This child cannot distinguish between a partner's temporary unavailability and permanent rejection, between someone's need for space and their preparation to leave forever. Every small disappointment becomes confirmation of the child's deepest fear, that love, once again, will prove to be temporary. The wounded child within us often learned to survive through hyper-independence, developing the capacity to meet our own needs, not as a healthy expression of autonomy, but as a desperate protection against ever again experiencing the helplessness of unmet dependency. We learn to pride ourselves on needing no one, not recognizing that what felt like strength was actually the armor of a heart that had been broken by those who should have cherished it most carefully. Sometimes the orphaned child learned to survive through the opposite strategy, becoming so adept at reading others' needs, so skilled at providing what others required that our own needs became invisible even to ourselves. This child learned that love could only be secured through usefulness, that affection had to be earned through perfect attunement to others' requirements, that the price of connection was the complete abandonment of our own emotional reality. The reparenting of the inner orphan begins with the recognition that this child's fears are not irrational, but are based on real experiences of abandonment, neglect, or inconsistent care. We cannot heal this wounded aspect by dismissing its concerns or forcing it to trust before it feels safe. Instead, we must prove to this child, through our own consistent self-care and gradually expanding capacity for healthy relationship, that it is possible to create the kind of secure connection it never experienced in childhood. This healing work requires tremendous patience, for the inner orphan has learned to test every relationship until it breaks, to create the familiar experience of abandonment rather than risk the unknown territory of consistent love. The child would rather recreate known patterns of loss than venture into the unexplored landscape of secure attachment, for at least abandonment feels familiar, predictable, something the child knows how to survive. The healing also requires us to grieve the childhood we never had, the parents who could not provide what we needed, the sense of fundamental safety that should have been our birthright but was never offered. This grief is not self-pity but a necessary honoring of what was lost, a recognition of how much courage it has taken to continue seeking love, despite early experiences that taught us love was unreliable, conditional, or simply unavailable. as we learn to provide ourselves with the consistent care the inner child needed, speaking to ourselves with kindness rather than criticism, offering ourselves comfort during times of distress, keeping promises we make to ourselves. The orphaned aspect begins to develop what Jung called basic trust. Not naive optimism, but the gradual recognition that it is possible to create relationships based on something more reliable than the inconsistent care we once received. The healing of the inner orphan requires us to learn the difference between healthy interdependence and the desperate dependency that characterized our earliest attempts to secure love. We must discover how to need others without collapsing into them, how to receive care without losing ourselves, how to offer love without abandoning our own emotional reality. The child within us must learn that mature love includes both autonomy and connection, both independence and healthy mutual dependency. Sometimes this healing work reveals that we have been unconsciously choosing partners who recreate familiar patterns of abandonment, unavailability, or inconsistent care, not because we enjoy suffering, but because the familiar dynamics allow the inner orphan to replay and attempt to master the original trauma. The child keeps returning to versions of the original wounding, hoping this time to receive the love that was denied, to finally win the affection that was always conditional. The healed inner child becomes our guide into secure attachment, the capacity to remain open to love without collapsing into desperate need, to offer our hearts without losing our sense of self, to receive care without the constant fear that it will be withdrawn without warning. This child teaches us how to be vulnerable from a place of strength rather than desperate need, how to ask for what we require without the terror that our needs make us unlovable. As the orphaned child heals, we develop what psychologists call earned security, the ability to create stable, nurturing relationships despite early experiences that taught us love was dangerous or unreliable. We learn to recognize healthy partners who can provide consistent care, to build relationships gradually rather than rushing toward intensity that might overwhelm our still healing capacity for trust, to communicate our needs clearly rather than expecting others to intuitively understand our unspoken requirements. The healing also allows us to offer love to others without the desperate quality that comes from our own unmet needs. The reprinted child within us no longer seeks romantic partners to provide the parenting we never received, but can engage in mutual adult love where both people offer care from fullness rather than attempting to extract it from emptiness. In this transformation, we discover that the child's original need for secure attachment was not weakness, but the most fundamental human requirement, the need for connection that allows the soul to develop, flourish, and eventually offer its own gifts to the world. The orphaned child's healing serves not just our individual capacity for love, but contributes to the collective healing of our species' relationship to attachment, dependency, and the sacred trust that should exist between those who love each other. The inner orphan, once healed, becomes our teacher in the art of receiving love, showing us how to accept care without suspicion, how to trust gradually and appropriately, how to remain open to connection even after experiencing disappointment. This child teaches us that healing happens not through the avoidance of all risk, but through the careful, conscious choice of relationships that can hold both our wounds and our capacity for growth. The journey from orphaned child to securely attached adult is not a straight path, but a spiral dance of healing, with moments of profound trust alternating with episodes of familiar fear, times of courageous vulnerability, followed by periods of protective withdrawal. The child heals not all at once, but gradually, through repeated experiences of consistent care that slowly convince the wounded psyche that not all love is temporary, Not all connection leads to abandonment. Not all. Trust results in betrayal. Sometimes the healing requires us to set boundaries with family members or early caretakers whose continued inconsistency would rewound the healing child, choosing instead to prioritize relationships that support our growing capacity for secure attachment. The inner orphan learns to distinguish between those who can truly see and cherish us and those who remain trapped in their own patterns of abandonment and unavailability. As the child within us heals, we become capable of what Jung called conscious relationship, intimacy that includes awareness of our wounds and triggers, love that can hold space for both our needs and our partner's autonomy, connection that honors the child's legitimate need for security, while also celebrating the adult's capacity for independent choice and growth. The orphaned child's healing ultimately serves the restoration of our faith in love itself, not the naive belief that love will never disappoint, but the mature understanding that secure attachment is possible, that we can learn to choose relationships based on their capacity to provide the consistent care our souls require, that we can heal from early wounds without carrying them forward into every new connection. In the end, the inner orphan becomes our guide into the mystery of earned security, the profound healing that occurs when someone who learned early that love was unreliable discovers, through patient work and carefully chosen relationships, that it is possible to create the kind of consistent, nurturing connection the child always needed. This transformation serves not only our individual healing, but contributes to the collective evolution of our species toward more secure, conscious, and genuinely nurturing forms of love. In the deepest chambers of the human heart, where love beckons with its promise of transcendence and union, there lurks a terror so profound, so existentially threatening, that it can transform the very approach of intimacy into a source of panic that sends even the most courageous souls fleeing into the familiar territory of separateness. This is not the simple fear of rejection or abandonment, not the wounded child's terror of being left alone, but something far more paradoxical and complex, the fear of engulfment, the unconscious terror that love, in its most complete expression, threatens to dissolve the very boundaries of the separate self that we have spent a lifetime constructing and defending. Love, when it approaches in its most transcendent form, whispers of possibilities that simultaneously thrill and terrify the ego, the possibility of merger, of dissolution, of a union so complete that the separate self might disappear entirely into the vastness of connection with another soul. It is this prospect of dissolution that sends the ego into its most sophisticated forms of panic, triggering elaborate retreat mechanisms designed to preserve the integrity of individual identity at any cost, even if that cost is the very intimacy our deepest nature craves. The fear of engulfment runs through the psyche like an underground river, carrying within its dark currents the accumulated wisdom of every moment when love became synonymous with the loss of self, when intimacy meant the abandonment of personal truth, when connection required such complete surrender of individual identity that the soul felt it might never find its way back to itself. This is the terror of the moth approaching the flame, knowing that to come too close might mean complete annihilation, yet unable to resist the pull of the very light that threatens to consume everything we believe ourselves to be. This fear often manifests most powerfully in those who have experienced what psychologists call enmeshment, relationships where love became a form of psychological imprisonment, where care was expressed through control, where intimacy required the complete sacrifice of personal boundaries, desires, and even thoughts to the overwhelming needs and expectations of another. In such relationships, the developing psyche learns that love is not a meeting of two separate beings, but a consumption of one by another, not a dance of intimacy and autonomy, but a surrender so complete that individual identity becomes impossible to maintain. Jung understood that the fear of engulfment touches something even deeper than personal history. It connects to the ego's fundamental terror of dissolution, its basic survival instinct to maintain the coherence of separate selfhood against any force that threatens to merge it into something larger. The ego, that heroic aspect of consciousness that has worked so diligently to establish individual identity, recognizes in deep intimacy a force that could undo all its careful construction of separate selfhood. When someone approaches us with genuine love, with the kind of open-hearted presence that invites true meeting, the unconscious recognizes this not as opportunity, but as danger, the approaching wave of intimacy that threatens to wash away the carefully constructed barriers that keep self distinct from other, that maintain the precious boundaries of individual consciousness. The fear is not irrational, but emerges from a deep wisdom about love's transformative power, its capacity to change us so completely that we might no longer recognize ourselves when the process is complete. This terror manifests in countless ways throughout our intimate relationships. The compulsive need to create conflict just when harmony threatens to become too comfortable. The sudden discovery of fundamental incompatibilities precisely when connection deepens beyond the superficial. The overwhelming urge to flee or create distance whenever a relationship approaches the threshold of true vulnerability and mutual recognition. We find ourselves pulling away, not because we don't want love, but because we want it too much, and the prospect of complete surrender to its transformative power feels like a form of death. The fear of engulfment often carries within it the ghost of codependency, that particular form of relationship where individual identity becomes so entangled with another's needs, moods, and reality that separate selfhood begins to disappear. Those who have emerged from codependent relationships often develop an almost allergic reaction to any form of intimacy that suggests merger or deep interdependence, having learned through painful experience that love can become a prison where personal autonomy is traded for connection, where individual truth is sacrificed for relational harmony. In some cases, this fear emerges from having witnessed or experienced relationships where love became a form of possession, where one person's affection manifested as a consuming need to know every thought, control every action, monitor every relationship, until the beloved became not a separate being to be cherished, but an extension of the lover's own ego to be managed and controlled. The psyche that has encountered such consuming love develops exquisite sensitivity to any sign that intimacy might again become a form of imprisonment. The fear is particularly complex because it often coexists with an equally powerful longing for exactly the kind of deep union it dreads. The same soul that retreats in terror from engulfment also yearns for transcendence, for the dissolution of lonely separateness into the bliss of complete understanding and acceptance. This creates an internal war between the ego's need for preservation and the soul's hunger for transformation through love, a conflict that can create patterns of approach and avoidance that leave both the individual and their potential partners confused and frustrated. Sometimes the fear of engulfment masks a deeper terror about our own capacity for love, the unconscious recognition that if we truly allowed ourselves to love completely, we might become the kind of consuming presence we fear encountering in others. Those who have felt the overwhelming power of their own loving nature, who have experienced their own capacity for jealousy, possessiveness, or all-consuming devotion, may unconsciously retreat from intimacy to protect potential partners from the intensity of their own emotional reality. The cultural messages that surround us often reinforce these fears, particularly for those who have been raised to value independence above all else, who have internalized messages that needing others is weakness, that emotional interdependence is somehow less evolved than complete self-sufficiency. In such contexts, the natural human need for intimate connection becomes pathologized, viewed as a threat to personal development rather than an essential aspect of psychological wholeness. Yet Jung's profound understanding of relationship reveals that the fear of engulfment rests on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of true intimacy. Genuine love does not require the sacrifice of self, but rather the expansion of self to include another, not the dissolution of personal boundaries, but their transformation from walls that separate into membranes that both protect and allow exchange. The ego fears engulfment because it imagines intimacy as conquest rather than collaboration, as consumption rather than communion. True intimacy, as Jung understood it, does not diminish individual identity, but enriches it through the mirror of authentic relationship. When we are truly seen and loved by another, we do not lose ourselves, but discover aspects of our being that only emerge in the context of genuine connection. The self that fears engulfment is often a false self, constructed from protective strategies and defensive adaptations, rather than emerging from our authentic nature. The healing of engulfment fears requires us to learn the delicate art of maintaining our center while opening our hearts, discovering that it is possible to love deeply without losing ourselves, to merge without disappearing, to surrender without abandoning our individual truth. This is perhaps one of the most sophisticated psychological achievements available to human consciousness, the capacity to remain fully present to our own inner reality while simultaneously opening to complete intimacy with another being. This healing often requires us to examine our concepts of love itself, to recognize where we may have confused love with possession, intimacy with control, connection with consumption. We must learn to distinguish between the healthy merging that occurs in transcendent moments of love and the pathological enmeshment that destroys individual identity. True love enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for autonomous choice and self-expression. The fear of engulfment also reveals our need to develop what Jung called a strong center, not the rigid boundaries of a defended ego, but the flexible stability of a self that knows its own ground so completely that it can dance with another without losing its essential nature. When we are rooted in our own authentic being, intimacy becomes not a threat to selfhood, but an opportunity for its fullest expression. Sometimes the healing requires us to explore our relationship with our own masculine and feminine aspects, recognizing that fears of engulfment often arise from an imbalance between these internal principles. The wounded masculine fears the dissolution that comes with surrendering to the feminine principle of receptivity and merging, while the wounded feminine fears the loss of identity that can come from too complete a surrender to another's reality. The integration of these internal opposites allows us to approach intimacy from a place of wholeness rather than seeking completion through another person. When we are already whole within ourselves, relationship becomes not a desperate attempt to fill internal emptiness, but a celebration of two complete beings choosing to share their fullness with each other. The fear of engulfment gradually dissolves as we learn to trust our own capacity to maintain individual identity within intimate relationship, as we develop the confidence that we can love completely without losing ourselves, that we can surrender to intimacy's transformative power without abandoning our essential nature. This trust develops not through reasoning, but through gradually expanding experiences of healthy intimacy that prove the ego's fears to be based on outdated information. As the fear diminishes, we discover that what we feared as engulfment was actually an invitation to expansion, the opportunity to experience ourselves more completely through the mirror of authentic relationship, to discover aspects of our nature that only emerge when we feel truly safe to be vulnerable with another being. The dissolved boundaries we once feared become the very openings through which love flows to heal and transform both lovers. The journey beyond engulfment fears often requires us to grieve relationships where love was indeed experienced as consumption, where intimacy did require the sacrifice of selfhood, where the natural boundaries of individual identity were violated in the name of love. This grief allows us to distinguish between the pathological forms of relationship we once experienced and the healthy intimacy that honors both connection and autonomy. In mature love, we discover that true intimacy actually requires strong individual identity, that only when we know ourselves completely can we offer authentic presence to another, that only when we are comfortable with our own boundaries can we choose consciously when to open them, when to merge, and when to maintain our separate space. The fear of engulfment dissolves when we realize that healthy love enhances rather than threatens our individual development. The healed relationship to intimacy allows us to experience what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites, to be simultaneously individual and connected, separate and merged, autonomous and interdependent. In this dynamic balance, we discover that love's promise of transcendence does not require the death of self, but rather its complete fulfillment through conscious relationship with another soul. The fear of engulfment ultimately serves as a guardian of authentic selfhood, protecting us from relationships that would indeed require the sacrifice of individual identity, while simultaneously preventing us from experiencing the kind of love that would actually enhance our capacity for self-expression. As this fear heals, it transforms from a wall that keeps love out into a wise boundary that helps us distinguish between connections that serve our growth and those that would diminish our authentic nature. In the end, we discover that the ego's fear of dissolution through love carries within it a profound wisdom, not about love's dangers, but about love's power, to transform us so completely that we become capable of experiencing ourselves and life itself in ways that our defended, separate self could never imagine. The fear dissolves not because we overcome love's transformative power, but because we finally trust ourselves enough to surrender to it, knowing that what emerges from love's transformative fire is not the destruction of who we are, but the revelation of who we have always been, beneath the layers of protection and defense that once seemed necessary for survival. In the beginning, there is always the golden dream, in those first intoxicating moments when another soul crosses the threshold of our awareness. We do not see them. We see ourselves, reflected back through the prism of their being like sunlight through crystal, transformed into something more luminous than we dared believe possible. We fall, not into love with them, but into love with the projection of our own unlived life, our own unacknowledged beauty, our own unrealized potential, shimmering just beneath the surface of their eyes. This is the ancient alchemy of attraction, the unconscious casting of our inner gold onto another's form, watching as they become the carrier of everything we have not yet become, the vessel of every dream we have not yet dared to dream. They become not a person, but a promise, not a human being with their own complex inner landscape, of joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, but a living symbol of all that we believe ourselves to lack. In this golden haze of projection, the beloved takes on mythic proportions. They are not merely attractive, they are divine. Their laugh does not simply please us, it heals something ancient and broken within our hearts. Their touch does not merely stir our flesh, it awakens dormant chambers of the soul we had forgotten existed. We see in them the mother we never had, the father who never understood us, the friend who never betrayed us, the lover who will never leave us. They become the answer to every question our hearts have been asking in the darkness of lonely nights. But projection, like all forms of unconscious magic, carries within it the seeds of its own dissolution. Reality, patient and persistent as morning light, begins to seep through the golden veils we have woven around our beloved. Slowly, then suddenly, the human being begins to emerge from behind the divine mask we have placed upon their face. Perhaps they speak harshly when tired, and we discover they are not the endless fountain of patience we imagined. Perhaps they disagree with us on something we consider fundamental, and we realize they have their own mind, their own values, their own ways of moving through the world that may not align with our dreams. Perhaps they fail to read our minds, fail to anticipate our needs, fail to be the perfectly attuned parent, lover, friend, savior we unconsciously expected them to be. In these moments of disillusionment, when the golden projection begins to crack and peel away like old paint in the harsh light of ordinary Tuesday morning reality, something profound occurs within the human psyche. The ego, which had invested so deeply in the fantasy, experiences what feels like betrayal. But it is not the beloved who has betrayed us. It is reality itself, with its insistence on being real rather than perfect, human rather than divine, limited rather than limitless. This is the moment of choice that determines the fate of countless potential relationships. Faced with the challenge of loving an actual person rather than a projected ideal, many souls retreat. They pull away, sometimes gradually, sometimes with shocking swiftness, as if the beloved has suddenly become contaminated with the terrible disease of being human. The withdrawal serves what the ego perceives as a protective function. If we stay, we will be forced to confront the gap between our fantasies and reality. We will be required to do the difficult work of learning who this person actually is, rather than who we dreamed they might be. We will be asked to love them not for how they complete us, but for who they are in their own right. We will be called to witness their struggles, their growth, their moments of weakness and confusion, their entirely human journey of becoming. This kind of love, love stripped of projection, love based on seeing and accepting what is rather than what we wish could be, requires a maturity of soul that not everyone is prepared to offer. It asks us to love not from our emptiness, seeking to be filled, but from our wholeness, seeking to give. It demands that we release our beloved from the impossible burden of being our salvation and allow them the dignity of their own flawed, beautiful, utterly human existence. The ego prefers the perfect love that exists in imagination to the imperfect love that exists in relationship. In fantasy, our beloved never disappoints us, never challenges our worldview, never asks us to grow beyond our current understanding of ourselves. In fantasy, love is always rapture, never negotiation, always ecstasy, never the mundane work of learning to share bathroom space and make decisions together about what to have for dinner. But the soul knows something the ego has forgotten. That projection is not the enemy of love, but its necessary precursor. Jung understood this with the clarity of someone who had walked the labyrinthine paths of the human psyche and emerged with maps for those who would follow. Projection, he recognized, is how consciousness develops. We must first see ourselves reflected in another before we can learn to withdraw those projections and encounter who they actually are. The golden phase of projection serves a sacred purpose. It gives us a glimpse of our own unlived potential, shows us what we are capable of becoming when we are reflected back to ourselves through loving eyes. It awakens us to possibilities within ourselves we had not recognized, calls forth qualities we had not known we possessed. The beloved becomes a mirror in which we catch our first clear glimpse of our own hidden beauty, our own capacity for tenderness, our own ability to feel deeply and love fully. But this is only the first movement in love's symphony. The second movement, the withdrawal of projections, is where the real music begins. This is where we are asked to see our beloved not as the carrier of our projections, but as a separate being with their own inner life, their own dreams and fears, their own relationship with the mystery of existence. Those who pull away during this crucial transition often do so because they are not yet ready for the spiritual maturity that real love requires. They are still too identified with their own needs, too caught in their own unconscious patterns, too afraid of the vulnerability that comes with truly seeing and being seen by another human being. The withdrawal feels safer because it allows us to preserve our fantasies intact. If we leave before the projection fully dissolves, we can tell ourselves that somewhere out there exists the perfect love we imagined, that this person simply wasn't the one, that our dreams remain possible with someone else. We avoid the confrontation with reality that would force us to grow, to become more conscious, to develop the capacity for loving what is, rather than what we wish could be. But this safety comes at a tremendous cost. By fleeing from the challenge of loving a real person, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to develop genuine intimacy. We remain trapped in the endless cycle of projection and withdrawal, moving from one relationship to another, always searching for the perfect mirror, never learning to love the flawed and beautiful reality of human connection. The pattern becomes addictive. The initial high of projection feels so intoxicating, so transcendent that we begin to mistake it for love itself. We become projection junkies, chasing the golden moments of idealization while fleeing from the deeper satisfactions of authentic intimacy. We prefer the ecstatic delusion to the ordinary miracle of being truly known and accepted by another human being. What we don't understand in these moments of withdrawal is that the disillusionment itself is not the enemy, it is the doorway. The cracking of our projections is not the end of love, but its true beginning. When we see our beloved clearly, freed from the golden veils of our own unconscious contents, we are given the opportunity to love them for who they are, rather than who we need them to be. This kind of love is not as immediately intoxicating as projection-based attraction, but it is infinitely more sustainable, more real, more capable of growing and deepening over time. It is love that can weather the storms of ordinary life, love that finds beauty in imperfection, love that chooses to stay when the initial magic fades and the real work begins. The soul that chooses to stay through the dissolution of projections embarks on a journey that transforms not only their capacity for relationship, but their entire understanding of themselves. By learning to love another person in their wholeness, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, known and unknown, we develop the capacity to love ourselves in our own wholeness. We learn that perfection is not a prerequisite for love, that beauty exists not despite our flaws, but because of our complete humanity. But this learning requires courage. It asks us to face our own unconscious expectations, to examine the ways we have been using relationship to avoid our own inner work, to confront the places where we are still demanding that others complete us rather than complement us. It requires us to grow up, to develop the psychological muscles necessary for genuine intimacy. The projection withdrawal, then, is not simply about romantic relationships, though it plays out most dramatically in that arena. It is about our fundamental approach to otherness, our ability to see beyond our own needs and desires, to recognize the independent existence and inherent worth of every being we encounter. When we withdraw our projections from our beloved, we don't lose the gold we saw in them, we reclaim it. We recognize that the beauty, the mystery, the divine spark we perceived in them was not actually theirs alone, but a reflection of the universal light that shines through all conscious beings when we have eyes to see it. We discover that the qualities we projected onto them exist within us as potential, waiting to be developed through our own conscious work, rather than sought through fusion with another. This is the profound paradox at the heart of projection withdrawal. In losing our fantasy of the perfect other, we find our own capacity for wholeness. In releasing our beloved from the burden of being our salvation, we free ourselves to become agents of our own transformation. In accepting their humanity, we embrace our own. The ego experiences this process as loss, as disillusionment, as the death of dreams. And in a sense, it is. The dream of finding completion through another must die if we are to discover our own completeness. The fantasy of perfect love must dissolve if we are to experience real love. The projection of our unlived life onto another must be withdrawn if we are to live that life ourselves. But what the ego experiences as death, the soul recognizes as birth. Each withdrawn projection is a piece of our own power, our own beauty, our own divinity reclaimed. Each moment of disillusionment is an opportunity to develop a more mature understanding of love, relationship, and the sacred work of consciousness in human form. Those who have learned to stay through the dissolution of projections often speak of discovering a love deeper and more satisfying than anything they could have imagined in their projection-clouded days. They describe the profound intimacy that becomes possible when two people see each other clearly, the unexpected beauty that emerges when we learn to love the reality rather than the fantasy, the strength that develops when relationship becomes a container for mutual growth rather than mutual projection. They understand that the withdrawal of projections is not the end of mystery in relationship, but the beginning of a different kind of mystery. The endless fascination of coming to know another soul in all its complexity, the ongoing revelation of who someone becomes when they are truly seen and loved, the perpetual surprise of discovering new depths in someone we thought we knew completely. This is love matured, love that has survived its own disillusionment and emerged transformed. It is love that can hold paradox, finding the sacred in the mundane, the eternal in the temporal, the perfect in the imperfect. It is love that has learned to see the divine not as something separate from humanity, but as something that expresses itself through humanity in all its messy, beautiful, utterly real manifestations. But reaching this mature love requires passing through the fires of projection withdrawal, and not everyone is ready for that passage. Some souls are still too young, too wounded, too identified with their own needs to offer the kind of conscious presence that real intimacy demands. They need more time, more healing, more development of their own inner resources before they can engage in the challenging work of loving what is rather than what they wish could be. There is no judgment in this recognition. We all mature at our own pace, develop consciousness according to our own inner timing. The soul that withdraws from relationship during the projection dissolution phase is simply honoring their current capacity, acknowledging their present limitations, choosing to preserve their energy for the inner work that must precede genuine intimacy. The tragedy lies not in the withdrawal itself, but in the lack of consciousness around it. When we pull away without understanding why, when we blame our beloved for the crime of being human rather than recognizing our own unconscious expectations, when we interpret the dissolution of projections as evidence that they are not the one, rather than as an invitation to develop our own capacity for real love, we miss the profound teaching that the experience offers. We remain trapped in the cycle, doomed to repeat the same pattern with the next person who catches the light of our projections, and the next, always seeking externally what can only be found through conscious inner work. We become refugees from reality, citizens of a fantasy realm where perfect love exists just around the corner, always just beyond our reach. The path forward requires radical honesty with ourselves about our expectations, our projections, our unconscious demands that others complete what only we can complete within ourselves. It requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites, to love both the ideal and the real, to find the sacred not in perfection but in the willingness to engage consciously with what is. This is the profound invitation hidden within the projection withdrawal phase, to grow beyond the need for perfect love and develop the capacity for real love, to release our beloved from the burden of being our salvation and discover our own inherent wholeness, to transform the disappointment of shattered illusions into the foundation for authentic intimacy. The soul that accepts this invitation embarks on one of the most challenging and rewarding journeys available to human consciousness, the journey from unconscious projection to conscious relationship, from seeking completion through another to offering completion to the world, from falling in love with our own reflections to learning to love the mysterious, unpredictable, endlessly fascinating reality of other human beings. This is where love becomes not just an emotion, but a practice, not just a feeling, but a conscious choice, not just a projection of our own needs, but a recognition of the divine mystery that expresses itself through every soul we are privileged to encounter in this brief and precious incarnation. Beneath the surface of every human heart lies a wound so ancient, so primal, that it predates memory itself, the original separation from the wholeness we once knew, the first severing from the oceanic unity that cradled us before consciousness dawned. This is the collective shadow of abandonment, the species-wide trauma that lives in our bones, writes itself into our genetic code, and whispers through our bloodlines like an underground river of inherited sorrow. It is the wound that remembers when humans first looked up at the stars and felt alone. When the first child experienced the terror of the mother turning away. When the first lover learned that even the deepest connection could be severed by death, distance, or the simple human capacity for choosing otherwise. This primordial abandonment echoes through generations, creating patterns of protection that once served survival, but now sabotage the very connections our souls most deeply crave. When we pull away first in relationship, when we retreat at the first sign of vulnerability or investment, when we choose the safety of solitude over the risk of intimacy, we often believe we are acting from our own individual wisdom or wound. But look deeper, and you will find the ghostly fingerprints of ancestral trauma, the inherited script of emotional withdrawal written by those who came before us, who learned through harsh experience that love equals loss, that closeness leads to crushing, that the heart is too tender an organ to leave unguarded in this dangerous world. The collective shadow speaks through family systems like an oracle of old sorrows. It carries forward the unprocessed grief of parents who lost children to war, famine, disease, or the thousand small cruelties that history visits upon the innocent. It holds the accumulated wisdom of mothers who learned not to invest too deeply in infants, who might not survive their first winter, of fathers who hardened their hearts because tenderness in a violent world was a luxury they could not afford. This shadow consciousness lives in the spaces between words, in the things families never speak about, in the sudden silences that fall when certain subjects arise. It expresses itself in the ways parents unconsciously teach their children to be self-sufficient, to not need too much, to prepare for disappointment by expecting it. It whispers through cultural messages that celebrate independence above interdependence, that mistake invulnerability for strength, that confuse emotional armor with wisdom. We inherit not only our ancestors' DNA, but their strategies for survival, their methods of protecting the heart from breaking, their carefully constructed walls against the possibility of devastating loss. The child who learns early not to cry too hard, lest they be seen as too needy, carries forward their mother's unexpressed fear of her own abandonment. The adolescent who builds elaborate defenses against rejection embodies their father's unconscious terror of being left behind, unloved, ultimately alone. The collective shadow of abandonment runs deeper than individual family systems, seeping into the very foundations of culture itself. Modern society, with its emphasis on autonomy and self-reliance, its celebration of the individual who needs no one, its suspicion of those who dare to express genuine need or dependence, reflects a collective defensive strategy against the primal terror of abandonment. We live in a civilization that teaches us to be suspicious of our own longings for connection, to see vulnerability as weakness rather than courage, to interpret our natural human need for belonging as evidence of personal inadequacy. We are raised on stories that celebrate the lone hero who saves the day without help, the self-made success who needs no one, the stoic figure who faces life's challenges in noble isolation. These cultural myths serve the collective shadow, reinforcing the ancient defensive patterns that once protected our species from the devastating impact of loss, but now prevent us from accessing the very connections that would heal our deepest wounds. They create a world where pulling away feels safer than staying close, where emotional distance is mistaken for maturity, where the fear of abandonment paradoxically leads us to abandon others before they can abandon us. Jung understood that the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge or accept, operates not only at the personal level but at the collective level as well. The collective shadow of abandonment represents humanity's unresolved relationship with loss, separation, and the fundamental vulnerability of being creatures capable of love in a world where love can always be taken away. This collective shadow manifests in countless ways throughout human societies. It appears in our economic systems that prioritize competition over collaboration, creating artificial scarcity and teaching us that others' success means our own diminishment. It expresses itself in political structures that divide rather than unite, that foster an us versus them mentality rooted in the ancient fear that there is not enough love, resources, or safety to go around. It lives in our religious and spiritual traditions that often emphasize transcendence of human connection, rather than the sacred nature of interdependence, teaching us to seek salvation in escape from the messy reality of human relationship, rather than through the conscious engagement with it. It whispers through therapeutic approaches that focus so intensely on individual healing that they inadvertently reinforce the myth that we can or should be able to whole ourselves through solitary effort. The collective shadow of abandonment is particularly potent because it contains within it a paradox that the mind struggles to resolve. The very capacity that makes us human, our ability to form deep emotional bonds, to love beyond survival necessity, to create meaning through connection, also makes us uniquely vulnerable to the pain of separation. We are the species that loves knowing that death makes all love temporary, that forms attachments while understanding that all attachments must eventually end. This existential contradiction creates what Jung might call a fundamental split in human consciousness. Part of us longs desperately for connection, recognizing it as our deepest need and greatest joy. Another part of us fears that very longing, understanding it as the source of our greatest vulnerability and potential suffering. The collective shadow emerges from our inability to hold these opposite truths simultaneously. Our tendency to choose either naive attachment or cynical detachment, rather than the mature love that embraces both connection and impermanence. When we pull away from relationship, we are often not just protecting ourselves from personal rejection, but enacting an ancient protective ritual that has been performed by countless generations before us. We are participating in a collective strategy of emotional survival that has been refined over millennia, passed down through bloodlines and cultural conditioning like a sacred tradition of the heart's self-defense. The tragedy of this inherited pattern is that what once served genuine protection now often prevents the very healing that our traumatized ancestors most needed. The emotional walls that protected them from devastating loss in genuinely dangerous situations now protect us from the possibility of deep healing in relationships that could offer safety, understanding, and the gradual repair of our deepest wounds. We become prisoners of other people's necessary defenses, carrying armor that no longer fits the battles we face, wielding swords against enemies that exist more in inherited memory than present reality. The child who experienced genuine abandonment teaches their children to guard against abandonment that may never come. The generation that survived genuine scarcity teaches the next generation to hoard love even in times of abundance. Breaking free from this collective pattern requires developing what Jung called consciousness, the ability to see our inherited patterns clearly enough to choose whether to enact them or transcend them. It asks us to distinguish between the wisdom contained in our ancestral defenses and the places where those defenses have outlived their usefulness, where they protect us from ghosts while preventing us from embracing the living opportunities for love that surround us. This consciousness work is not just personal but collective. It requires us to understand that our individual patterns of withdrawal are connected to much larger patterns of human wounding and healing. When we pull away from love, we are not just enacting our personal history, but participating in humanity's long struggle to find ways to love fully in a world where loss is inevitable. The collective shadow of abandonment carries within it not only trauma, but also the seeds of wisdom. Our ancestors' strategies for survival, their capacity to endure devastating loss and continue loving despite repeated heartbreak, their ability to find connection even in the midst of genuine danger. These represent profound human achievements, evolutionary adaptations that have allowed our species not just to survive, but to thrive. The challenge for contemporary consciousness is to honor the wisdom in our inherited patterns while updating them for current reality. We must learn to distinguish between genuine threat and shadow projections, between situations that truly require protective withdrawal and moments when our fear is preventing us from receiving the love we actually need. This discernment requires developing a relationship with our own family history, understanding the specific flavors of abandonment trauma that run through our particular lineage. Some families carry the trauma of immigration and displacement, the deep knowing that home can be taken away without warning. Others hold the wound of economic devastation, the understanding that security is always temporary, that those we depend on can disappear without notice. Some bloodlines carry the shadow of early death, generations who learned not to love too deeply because loss was so common, so expected, so woven into the fabric of daily life. Others hold the trauma of emotional abandonment, families where parents were physically present but emotionally unavailable, creating children who learned that even those who stay can leave you feeling utterly alone. Each family system develops its own unique strategies for managing the collective shadow of abandonment. Some become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signs that love is about to be withdrawn. Others become preemptively dismissive, rejecting connection before it can reject them. Some families teach emotional self-sufficiency as the highest virtue, while others create enmeshed systems where individual identity is sacrificed to prevent anyone from ever leaving. Understanding these inherited patterns allows us to see our own relationship behaviors with greater clarity and compassion. When we recognize that our tendency to pull away carries forward our grandmother's strategy for surviving her husband's death in war, or our father's method of protecting himself from his own father's emotional absence, we can begin to separate past wisdom from present appropriateness. This recognition does not diminish the validity of our ancestors' choices or the reality of their suffering. Instead, it honors their experience while acknowledging that what served them in their circumstances may not serve us in ours. It allows us to carry forward the strength and resilience they developed while updating their strategies to match the opportunities and challenges of our own time. The healing of collective abandonment trauma happens not through individual effort alone, but through conscious relationship, through the willingness to stay present with others, even when our inherited patterns urge us to flee, to offer the very consistency and reliability that our bloodlines have been longing for across generations. When we choose to remain in relationship during moments when every fiber of our being wants to run, when we learn to distinguish between genuine red flags and inherited fears, when we develop the capacity to love steadily, even when our ancient wounds are activated, we are not just healing ourselves. We are healing the collective shadow, offering our ancestors the experience they never had, the love they always deserved. This healing work requires tremendous courage because it asks us to act against instincts that were developed for our protection. It requires us to trust that the present moment is different from the past, that the person before us is not the one who abandoned our great-grandmother, that love offered now can be received without the devastating consequences our inherited memory fears. But the rewards of this courage are profound, not just for us, but for the generations that will come after us. When we break the pattern of inherited withdrawal, we create new possibilities for our children and their children. We become ancestors who offer different strategies, different examples, different possibilities for how humans can love each other across the full spectrum of life's uncertainties. The collective shadow of abandonment will not be healed through denial or positive thinking, through pretending that loss is not a fundamental aspect of human experience. It will be healed through the development of what we might call tragic optimism, the capacity to love fully while acknowledging that all love ends, to invest deeply in connection while accepting that separation is woven into the very fabric of existence. This mature love honors both the wisdom of our ancestors' protections and the possibility of our own healing. It recognizes that the fear of abandonment contains within it the seed of its own transcendence, that only by learning to love despite the possibility of loss do we discover our own capacity for the kind of love that cannot truly be abandoned, the love that exists not as possession but as gift, not as guarantee but as grace. When we understand the collective nature of abandonment trauma, we can begin to hold our own patterns and those of others with greater compassion. We recognize that the person who pulls away, just as intimacy deepens, is not necessarily rejecting us personally, but enacting an ancient protective ritual that has been passed down through generations who knew betrayal, loss, and the terrible vulnerability of the human heart. This understanding does not excuse harmful behavior or make us passive in the face of abandonment, but it does allow us to respond from a place of wisdom rather than reactive wounding. It helps us distinguish between moments when someone's withdrawal is about their own inherited patterns and moments when it represents a genuine incompatibility or unhealthy dynamic. Most importantly, it allows us to see our own journey toward conscious love as part of a much larger healing process, a collective evolution in humanity's capacity for intimacy, connection, and the mature navigation of love's eternal dance with loss. We become not just individuals seeking personal happiness, but participants in the ongoing transformation of human consciousness, ancestors in training for generations yet to come. In this understanding, every moment we choose presence over withdrawal, every time we risk love despite our inherited fears, every instance we offer others the consistency and reliability that our bloodlines have been longing for across centuries, we participate in the healing of humanity's deepest wound. We become agents of the very love our ancestors dreamed of but could not always access, carriers of the connection they fought to protect and preserve despite overwhelming odds. This is the profound invitation hidden within the collective shadow of abandonment, not to transcend our human need for connection, but to transform our relationship to that need, to love not from the desperation of the abandoned child, but from the wholeness of the conscious adult, who understands that love's temporary nature does not diminish its eternal significance, that the possibility of loss does not negate the reality of present connection. Through this transformation, we become ancestors our descendants can build upon rather than recover from, carriers of love's possibility rather than its impossibility, living bridges between humanity's traumatic past and its healing future. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the familiar pathways of relationship, however comfortable or intoxicating, begin to feel too small to contain the vastness stirring within. This is not the fearful withdrawal of the wounded heart, nor the reactive pulling away of the projected dream dissolving into ordinary reality. This is something altogether different, the soul's recognition that the work of becoming whole, of integrating all the scattered fragments of the self into a unified and conscious whole, sometimes requires a sacred stepping back from the mirrors of others' expectations, needs, and desires. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness, the gradual integration of conscious and unconscious contents of the psyche into a mature, authentic expression of who we truly are beneath all the roles we play, all the masks we wear, all the ways we shape ourselves to fit the needs and expectations of the world around us. It is the slow, often difficult process of becoming who we were always meant to be before the world taught us who we should be. Sometimes this journey demands solitude, not the empty solitude of the fearful heart hiding from connection, but the fertile solitude of the soul that has heard its own deepest calling and must temporarily withdraw from external influences to listen more clearly to the quiet voice of authentic selfhood emerging from within. This withdrawal carries a different quality than the patterns we have explored before. It moves not from wound, but from wisdom, not from fear, but from an inner knowing that recognizes the difference between loving from emptiness and loving from fullness, between seeking completion through another and offering our own completeness to the dance of relationship. The individuating soul understands, often through painful experience, that the constant mirror of relationship, while essential for growth and healing, can also become a subtle form of imprisonment if we never learn who we are when we are alone with ourselves. when we are not reflecting back someone else's needs or reshaping ourselves to maintain connection. In the early stages of psychological development, we discover ourselves primarily through relationship. We learn who we are by seeing how others respond to us, by observing what brings approval and what brings rejection, by watching how our presence affects those around us. This is natural and necessary. The ego forms through these relational reflections, developing a sense of identity through the feedback loop of social interaction. But there comes a point in maturation when this externally oriented identity formation becomes insufficient, even counterproductive. The soul begins to sense that there are aspects of its nature that can only be discovered in solitude, depths that can only be explored when we are not performing for anyone else's comfort, or expectations, truths that can only be heard when we step away from the constant noise of other people's voices and opinions. This recognition often arrives disguised as discontent. The relationship that once felt nourishing begins to feel constraining. The partner who once seemed perfect begins to feel like a distraction from some deeper calling. The social connections that once brought joy begin to feel superficial, inadequate for the profound conversations the soul longs to have with itself. This is not necessarily about the inadequacy of others, though it is easy to project our inner stirrings onto external circumstances. The beloved who suddenly feels too needy may simply be reflecting back our own need to step away from being needed. The friend who seems to demand too much of our time may be mirroring our own recognition that we have been giving our time everywhere except to the relationship with ourselves. The call to individuation often manifests as a growing awareness of the ways we have been living for others rather than from ourselves. We begin to notice how much of our energy goes toward managing other people's emotions, meeting their expectations, maintaining their comfort with who they need us to be. We recognize the subtle exhaustion that comes from chronic self-abandonment, from the constant monitoring of external approval that has replaced the inner compass of authentic choice. This awareness can be profoundly disorienting because it calls into question not just specific relationships, but our entire understanding of love, loyalty, and what it means to be a good person. Many of us have been conditioned to believe that caring for ourselves is selfish, that prioritizing our own inner work is self-indulgent, that stepping away from others' needs in order to tend to our own development is a betrayal of love itself. But the individuating soul begins to understand that this conditioning represents a fundamental misunderstanding of love's true nature. Real love, mature, sustainable, genuinely nourishing love, flows not from emptiness seeking to be filled, but from fullness seeking to be shared. It offers not from obligation or fear of abandonment, but from authentic generosity rooted in self-knowledge and inner abundance. To love from this place of wholeness, we must first discover what wholeness means for us individually. We must learn who we are when we are not trying to be who others need us to be. We must develop a relationship with our own inner authority, our own values, our own vision of what a life well lived might look like. This discovery cannot happen entirely within relationship because relationship inherently involves compromise, negotiation, the constant dance of two separate beings finding ways to harmonize their individual needs and desires. While this dance is beautiful and necessary, it can also obscure our access to our own authentic impulses if we never step away from it long enough to remember who we are when we are not dancing. The sacred withdrawal that serves individuation is recognizable by its quality of consciousness and intention. Unlike fear-based withdrawal, it does not run from intimacy but prepares for deeper intimacy. It does not reject love but seeks to understand what love means when it is not driven by neediness, projection, or unconscious compulsion. This withdrawal often involves a temporary stepping back from romantic relationship, but it can also manifest as a need for more solitude within existing relationships, clearer boundaries around personal time and space, or a reduction in social commitments that no longer serve the soul's current phase of development. The challenge lies in distinguishing between this healthy individuation impulse and the ego's various strategies for avoiding the real work of relationship. The difference is often subtle but crucial. Neurotic avoidance seeks to protect the ego from challenge, growth, and the vulnerability that authentic intimacy requires. Sacred withdrawal seeks to prepare the soul for more conscious engagement with life's challenges, including the challenge of loving another human being fully. One moves away from consciousness, the other toward it. One seeks to preserve existing patterns and avoid discomfort. The other willingly enters the discomfort of self-examination and inner transformation. One maintains the status quo of the personality's defenses. The other questions and potentially dismantles those defenses in service of greater authenticity. The individuating soul often experiences a profound loneliness during periods of conscious withdrawal, but it is a different quality of loneliness than that experienced by the wounded heart. It is the loneliness of the pioneer, the explorer, the artist who must venture into unknown territory alone before they can bring back treasures to share with others. It contains within it not desperation but anticipation, not emptiness but pregnant fullness. This solitude becomes a kind of sacred laboratory where the soul can experiment with different aspects of its nature without the immediate need to explain, justify, or modulate those experiments for another's comfort. It provides space to explore interests, values, creative expressions, and ways of being that might be too fragile or too unconventional to survive the immediate scrutiny of relationship. Many individuals discover during periods of conscious withdrawal that they have been living lives that are largely constructed around other people's definitions of success, happiness, and meaning. They begin to recognize the difference between what they genuinely value and what they have been taught to value, between what brings them authentic joy and what brings them social approval. This recognition can be both liberating and terrifying. Liberation comes from the recognition that we have more choice than we realized, that we are not condemned to live according to scripts written by others. Terror comes from the responsibility this recognition brings. If we can choose, then we must choose, and choice always involves risk, uncertainty, the possibility of making mistakes or disappointing others. The individuating soul must develop the capacity to tolerate this uncertainty, to act from inner guidance even when that guidance contradicts external expectations. This requires developing what Jung called a relationship with the self, that deeper center of personality that exists beneath the ego's constantly shifting identifications and reactions. The self, in Jung's understanding, represents our innate wholeness, the archetypal pattern of who we are meant to become when all our potentials are integrated and expressed consciously. Unlike the ego, which is largely shaped by external influences, the self emerges from within, carrying a kind of inner blueprint for our unique contribution to the world. Developing a relationship with the self requires learning to listen to inner promptings that may make no logical sense, to trust intuitions that contradict rational analysis, to follow creative impulses that serve no obvious practical purpose. It asks us to take seriously the dreams, fantasies, and seemingly irrational longings that emerge from the unconscious, recognizing them as communications from aspects of our nature that seek integration and expression. This inner dialogue cannot be rushed or forced. It requires the kind of patient attention that is difficult to maintain when we are constantly responding to others' immediate needs and emotional states. It needs space, silence, and the absence of external pressure to perform or produce anything in particular. During periods of conscious withdrawal, many individuals discover creative capacities they never knew they possessed, find themselves drawn to spiritual practices or philosophical inquiries that previously held no interest, or experience shifts in their fundamental worldview that surprise even themselves. These discoveries often feel simultaneously foreign and familiar, as if they are remembering something they once knew but had forgotten. The soul that honors these discoveries, that gives them room to develop and mature before subjecting them to external evaluation, often finds that they eventually become sources of great strength and authenticity in relationship. The artist who withdraws to develop their craft returns to relationship with something unique to offer. The individual who steps away to clarify their values comes back with clearer boundaries and more genuine presence. In the hidden laboratories of medieval alchemists, where mercury danced with sulfur in vessels sealed with wax and prayer, there was understood a sacred truth that the modern world has forgotten. Transformation requires dissolution. Before the base metal could become gold, it had first to lose all memory of what it had been. It had to surrender its very essence to the fire to become nothing, pure potential, swimming in chaos before it could be reborn as something infinitely more precious. The alchemists called this stage the nigredo, the blackening, where all form dissolves into primordial soup. They knew that this dissolution was not destruction but preparation, not ending but beginning. They watched with patient eyes as their materials liquefied, separated, reformed, and liquefied again, understanding that the vessel itself, the athanor, was as crucial as its contents. For without a strong container to hold the chaos, the transformation would scatter into meaninglessness. What those ancient seekers of gold discovered in their laboratories, we rediscover in the crucible of intimate relationship. Here, too, the familiar structures of selfhood begin to liquefy under the intense heat of genuine encounter with another soul. The carefully constructed persona, that mask we wear to navigate the social world, begins to melt like wax too close to flame. The comfortable boundaries between self and other start to blur. The ego, that proud architect of our conscious identity, watches in alarm as its carefully built monuments threaten to dissolve into something unrecognizable. This is why we pull away, not from lack of love, but from too much of it, not from indifference, but from the terror of transformation that love demands. The soul knows, even when the mind refuses to acknowledge, that true intimacy is an alchemical process that will change us at the most fundamental level. It will burn away everything that is false in us, everything that is merely borrowed from others' expectations, everything that serves our small self rather than our larger becoming. The ego, invested as it is in maintaining the status quo of our psychic organization, sounds its alarm bells when it senses this dissolution approaching. It whispers urgent warnings. This is too much. This is too dangerous. Retreat to safer ground where you can maintain control, where you know who you are, where the boundaries are clear. And so we step back from the fire before the transformation can complete itself, before we can discover what gold might emerge from the ashes of our familiar selves. But consider the alchemist who, seeing the materials in his vessel beginning to dissolve, rushes to remove them from the heat. He saves them from dissolution, yes, but he also saves them from transformation. The lead remains lead, unchanged and unchanging, stable in its baseness. The opportunity for gold is lost, perhaps forever. This is the tragedy of those who love but cannot surrender to love's alchemical demands. They feel the heat rising, see their careful self-constructions beginning to soften and shift, and in their fear, they pull away from the very process that could liberate them into their fullest becoming. They preserve the ego at the expense of the self, maintain their small identity while forfeiting their larger destiny. Yet we must understand this retreat with compassion, for it often comes from a deep knowing, however unconscious, of what transformation actually requires. The ego is not wrong to be afraid. Love does indeed threaten its sovereignty. Intimate relationship does indeed demand a kind of death, the death of who we have been in service of who we might become. The dissolution is real, and for a time, we genuinely do not know who we are or who we will be when the process completes itself. In the darkness of this unknowing, in the chaos of psychological dissolution, the untrained soul can feel as though it is disintegrating entirely, without understanding that this is precisely what must happen before genuine rebirth can occur. The natural response is to flee back to the familiar territory of separateness, where the boundaries of selfhood feel solid and certain once again. This is why Jung emphasized the crucial importance of what he called the transcendent function, that psychological capacity to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into either extreme. In relationship, this means learning to hold both the fear of dissolution and the longing for transformation, both the need for autonomy and the desire for union, both the safety of solitude and the growth that comes through encounter with the other. The alchemist's vessel, the Athanor, had to be strong enough to contain the intense heat and pressure of transformation without cracking. Similarly, the psyche undergoing relational alchemy requires what we might call containment, the capacity to remain present to the process of change without fragmenting under its intensity. This containment comes partly from self-knowledge, partly from trust in the transformative process itself, and partly from the understanding that what feels like dissolution is actually evolution. But here lies the paradox that those who pull away from love must ultimately face. The very qualities that would allow them to remain present to transformation, psychological strength, self-trust, faith in their own resilience, can only be fully developed through the transformative encounters they are avoiding. The vessel of the psyche is strengthened not by avoiding the heat of intimacy, but by learning to contain it without breaking. This is why the pattern of withdrawal often becomes self-perpetuating. Each retreat from transformative intimacy confirms the ego's belief that such encounters are too dangerous to be endured. Each step back from the fire reinforces the conviction that preservation of the current self is more important than evolution toward the larger self. The soul remains trapped in its base metal state, stable but unrefined, safe but unexpressed. Yet something in us knows better. Some deeper wisdom recognizes that we are meant for gold, not lead. Some interior alchemist continues working in the hidden laboratory of the unconscious, preparing us for the transformation we consciously resist. Dreams come carrying symbols of fire and dissolution. Fantasies arise of merger and rebirth. The body itself speaks in the language of longing, remembering what the mind has forgotten about our true nature and destiny. This is the beautiful tension of the human condition. We are simultaneously the metal that must be transformed and the alchemist directing the transformation. We are both the contents of the vessel and the vessel itself. We must learn to be patient with our own process, to understand that the resistance to change is itself part of the alchemical work. The ancient texts speak of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, as the fundamental rhythm of transformation. First, the old structure must be dissolved, then a new one must be allowed to form. But modern consciousness, trained as it is in linear thinking and immediate gratification, struggles with the dissolving phase. We want the gold without the melting, the transformation without the temporary chaos, the rebirth without the symbolic death. Those who pull away from love at the moment of potential transformation are often responding to this very struggle. They feel the dissolving begin and mistake it for destruction rather than recognizing it as the necessary prelude to reconstruction at a higher level. They feel their familiar sense of self becoming fluid and interpret this as a threat rather than as an opportunity for greater authenticity. But what if we understood differently? What if we recognized the liquefaction of our psychological structures as the soul's way of preparing us for a more integrated way of being? What if we trusted that the consciousness which has guided our development to this point will not abandon us in the midst of transformation? The alchemists had to learn patience above all else. They understood that certain processes could not be rushed, that attempting to force the transformation would only result in failure. They learned to tend the fire carefully, not too hot, not too cool, and to watch with loving attention as the materials in their vessel moved through their necessary phases of change. This is perhaps the greatest gift we can offer ourselves when standing at the threshold of transformative love: patience with our own process. Understanding that the impulse to withdraw is not necessarily a sign that we should withdraw, but rather a signal that we are approaching something significant. Learning to distinguish between the voice of wisdom that guides us away from genuinely harmful situations and the voice of fear that simply wants to avoid all growth and change. The psychological dissolution that intimate relationship can trigger is indeed disorienting. The boundaries between self and other do become more permeable. The familiar landmarks of personal identity do shift and change. But this is not pathology. It is possibility. It is the psyche's way of creating space for a more expansive way of being in the world. Jung spoke of the individuation process as a movement toward wholeness, a gradual integration of all aspects of the personality into a unified and authentic self. But this wholeness is not achieved in isolation. It is only through encounter with others, through the friction and harmony of relationship, that we discover who we really are beneath our carefully constructed personas. The alchemist's gold was not an end in itself, but a symbol of this psychological integration. It represented the achievement of a state where all elements of the personality work together in harmonious service of the larger self. It was the metal of psychological maturity, spiritual wisdom, emotional resilience, and authentic self-expression. But to achieve this golden state, the alchemist had to be willing to sacrifice the base metals of unconscious habit, automatic reaction, defensive positioning, and ego-driven behavior. These had to be dissolved in the fire of conscious engagement before the gold of integrated selfhood could emerge. This is what love offers us, the opportunity to discover what remains when everything false has been burned away, the chance to find out who we are when we can no longer hide behind our familiar masks and defenses, the possibility of meeting ourselves and another from a place of genuine authenticity rather than unconscious performance. Those who pull away from this opportunity are not wrong to sense its magnitude. Love is indeed dangerous to the status quo of personality. Intimacy does indeed threaten the ego's carefully maintained control. Relationship will indeed change us in ways we cannot predict or control. But perhaps the question is not how to avoid this transformation, but how to surrender to it consciously, how to participate actively in our own becoming. The alchemical texts describe a stage called the albedo, the whitening, where the dissolved materials begin to purify and clarify. This follows the darkness of the negredo and precedes the golden completion of the rubedo. It is a phase of growing clarity, where what seemed chaotic and threatening begins to reveal its hidden order and purpose. In the alchemy of relationship, this corresponds to the moment when the dissolution of old patterns begins to feel less like destruction and more like liberation. when the melting of familiar boundaries starts to seem less threatening and more promising, when we begin to sense that what we are becoming might be more beautiful than what we have been. But to reach this stage, we must first be willing to enter the darkness of not knowing, the chaos of dissolution, the vulnerability of allowing another's presence to change us at the deepest level. We must trust that consciousness itself is on our side in this process, that the same intelligence that brought us to this threshold will guide us through the transformation it offers. The ancient alchemists believed that their work was ultimately a collaboration with nature itself, with the inherent drive toward greater complexity and beauty that moves through all living systems. They saw themselves not as forcing change, but as creating conditions where natural transformation could occur. They learned to work with the material's own inherent tendencies rather than against them. Perhaps this is the key insight for those who find themselves pulled to withdraw from transformative intimacy. We are not being asked to force ourselves beyond our natural capacity, but rather to trust our own deep nature's movement toward wholeness and integration. We are being invited to collaborate with our own becoming rather than to resist it out of fear. The gold the alchemists sought was not foreign to the base metals they worked with. It was their own essential nature revealed through purification. Similarly, the transformation that love offers us is not an imposition of something alien, but the revelation of who we have always been beneath the layers of conditioning and defense. This is why the withdrawal from transformative relationship is often accompanied by such profound grief, even when it feels necessary for psychological survival. Some part of us knows that we are turning away from our own gold, our own possibility, our own deepest nature calling us home to itself. Yet even this grief serves the alchemical process. It keeps alive in us the knowledge that transformation is possible, that we are meant for something more than our current level of consciousness allows. It maintains the tension that will eventually draw us back to the fire when we have developed sufficient capacity to contain its heat. For the alchemist, failure was not the end of the work, but information about how to proceed more skillfully. Each unsuccessful experiment taught something valuable about the materials, the timing, the temperature, the conditions necessary for transformation. Nothing was wasted. Everything served the eventual success of the great work. So too with our withdrawals from transformative intimacy. Each retreat teaches us something about our current capacity, our growing edges, the conditions we need to feel safe enough to remain present to change. Each step back from the fire increases our understanding of what the fire requires and what we must develop within ourselves to meet it consciously. The goal is not to eliminate the fear of transformation, but to develop enough psychological strength and spiritual faith to act in the presence of that fear, not to pretend that love is not dangerous to the ego's constructions, but to choose the danger of growth over the safety of stagnation, not to avoid dissolution, but to learn the art of conscious dissolving and reforming. In the end, the alchemy of relationship returns us to ourselves, not the small self of ego identification, but the larger self of integrated wholeness. It offers us the chance to discover what we are made of when everything superficial has been burned away. It invites us to participate actively in our own transformation from the lead of unconsciousness into the gold of authentic being. This is the sacred work that intimate relationship offers, the opportunity to become who we truly are through the loving witness of another's presence, to discover our own gold through the patient application of love's transforming fire, to learn that what seemed like dissolution was actually the soul's way of making space for something infinitely more beautiful to emerge. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the long exile ends and the possibility of return begins to shimmer on the horizon. like a distant city seen through morning mist. This is not the return of the naive heart that fled in terror from love's demands, nor the desperate homecoming of one who has simply grown weary of solitude. This is the return of the prodigal heart, the one who has traveled far into the wilderness of self-discovery and emerges carrying treasures that can only be found in the depths of one's own being. The biblical parable speaks of a son who demanded his inheritance early, squandered it in foreign lands, and returned home humbled and transformed. But the deeper story here is not about financial recklessness or moral reformation. It is about the archetypal journey of consciousness itself. It is about the necessary departure from unconscious participation in relationship into the challenging but ultimately redemptive work of individuation and the eventual possibility of conscious return. Those who have learned why they pull away from intimacy have completed an essential phase of psychological development. They have descended into their own underworld, faced the dragons of projection and unconscious compulsion, wrestled with the shadow aspects of their personality, and emerged with something precious, self-knowledge. They have discovered not only what drives their patterns of withdrawal, but more importantly, what it means to love from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, choice rather than compulsion, consciousness rather than automatic reaction. This knowledge changes everything. Where once there was the blind repetition of inherited patterns, the unconscious replay of childhood dynamics, the automatic activation of defensive strategies learned in situations long past. Now there is the possibility of conscious choice. The one who understands their own psychology can begin to distinguish between the voice of wisdom that guides them away from genuinely harmful situations and the voice of fear that simply wants to avoid all vulnerability and growth. But understanding alone is not enough. Knowledge without integration remains merely intellectual, a collection of insights that may explain behavior without transforming it. The true return of the prodigal heart requires something more challenging, the willingness to risk vulnerability again, to step once more into the arena of intimate relationship, but this time armed with consciousness rather than innocence. This is perhaps the most delicate moment in the entire journey of psychological development. Having worked so hard to establish a sense of self, separate from the unconscious merger of early relationships, having learned to find wholeness within rather than seeking it from others, having discovered the capacity for solitude and self-sufficiency, why would anyone willingly risk these hard-won achievements by opening once again to intimate partnership? The answer lies in understanding the difference between two very different kinds of love. The first is the love of incompletion seeking completion, of emptiness seeking fulfillment, of fragmentation seeking wholeness through merger with another. This is the love that leads to codependency projection and the loss of individual identity in the swamp of unconscious relationship. It is from this kind of love that the wise soul learns to flee. But there is another love entirely, the love of completion celebrating completion, of fullness sharing fullness, of wholeness recognizing wholeness in another. This is the love that becomes possible only after the journey through withdrawal, shadow work, and individuation has been consciously undertaken. It is the love that flows not from need, but from abundance, not from deficit, but from overflow. Jung understood this distinction deeply when he wrote about the difference between relationship and relatedness. Relationship, in his view, was often an unconscious participation in mutual projections and shared complexes. But relatedness, true relatedness, was a conscious encounter between two individuated beings who had done the work of reclaiming their projections and taking responsibility for their own psychological wholeness. The prodigal heart returns not because it needs to be in relationship, but because it chooses to be. This choice, born from freedom rather than compulsion, changes the entire quality of intimate encounter. Where once there might have been the desperate clinging of someone trying to fill an inner void, now there can be the graceful dance of two complete beings choosing to share their completeness. But let us not romanticize this return or pretend that it happens easily or automatically. The soul that has learned to love solitude, that has discovered the peace of self-sufficiency, that has found security in the fortress of individuality, does not lightly surrender these achievements. There is a natural resistance to risking once again the vulnerability that intimate partnership demands, even when that partnership is entered consciously rather than compulsively. This resistance is not weakness, it is wisdom. The heart that has been wounded in the fire of unconscious relationship, that has experienced the pain of projection and merger and loss of self, quite naturally develops protective mechanisms. These mechanisms serve an important function during the phase of healing and individuation, but they can also become obstacles to conscious partnership if they remain rigidly in place after their protective function is no longer needed. The art of conscious return involves learning to recognize when protective mechanisms are serving genuine safety and when they have become habitual barriers to growth and connection. It requires developing what we might call psychological discernment, the capacity to distinguish between situations that genuinely threaten our hard-won self-knowledge and situations where our defensive patterns are simply operating automatically, protecting us from imaginary dangers. This discernment cannot be developed through thinking alone. It requires what Jung called the feeling function, not the emotion of sentiment, but the sophisticated psychological capacity to evaluate the worth and significance of experiences. It means learning to sense the difference between someone who would truly appreciate and honor our individuality and someone who would seek to possess or diminish it. It means developing trust in our own ability to maintain our sense of self even while opening to intimate encounter. But perhaps most challenging of all, the return of the prodigal heart requires faith. Faith that the work of self-discovery has indeed prepared us for the mystery of conscious partnership. There is no guarantee in this territory, no promise that vulnerability will be met with respect, that authenticity will be received with appreciation, that love offered from fullness will find a worthy recipient. The return requires a kind of leap of faith, a willingness to trust that our own development has prepared us for whatever we might encounter. This faith is not naive optimism. It is something much deeper and more resilient. It is faith in the process of consciousness itself, in the intelligence that has guided our development to this point, in our own capacity to respond wisely to whatever situations arise. It is faith that even if a particular relationship proves unsuitable or harmful, we now possess the tools to recognize this quickly and extract ourselves before significant damage occurs. The prodigal heart that returns does so with a different relationship to time itself. Where once there might have been urgency, the desperate need to find the one or to make any relationship work at all costs, now there can be patience. The one who has learned to love solitude is not afraid of it, and therefore is not driven to escape it through premature or inappropriate partnership. They can afford to wait for genuine compatibility, to take time to truly know another person before making significant commitments, to allow relationship to unfold naturally rather than forcing it into predetermined patterns. This patience is itself a form of love. Love for the natural process of getting to know another human being. Love for the gradual revelation of compatibility or incompatibility. Love for the mystery of how two individuated beings might choose to create something together while remaining fundamentally whole and complete in themselves. The skills developed during the period of withdrawal and individuation serve the returning heart well in this process of conscious partnership. The capacity for introspection becomes the ability to remain aware of one's own reactions and projections, even while engaged with another. The comfort with solitude becomes the foundation for healthy autonomy within relationship. The knowledge of one's own shadow becomes protection against unconsciously acting out destructive patterns. Most importantly, the hard-won understanding of one's own wholeness becomes the basis for genuine generosity in relationship. The one who is not seeking completion from another is free to offer their own gifts without hidden agenda, to love without strings attached, to give from abundance rather than attempting to extract from perceived scarcity. But this return is not simply a matter of individual readiness. It requires finding another soul who has undertaken their own journey of self-discovery, who brings their own wholeness to the encounter, rather than seeking to fill their emptiness through partnership. Two people operating from deficit cannot create abundance together, no matter how intense their mutual attraction or how deep their emotional connection. But two people who have found their own completeness can create something entirely new, a third thing that honors and enhances their individual development while adding a dimension of shared meaning that neither could achieve alone. Recognizing such a person requires all the discernment and psychological sophistication that the journey of individuation has developed. It means looking beyond surface compatibility or emotional intensity to assess the deeper question. Is this someone who has done their own psychological work? Is this someone who takes responsibility for their own healing rather than expecting others to provide it? Is this someone who can appreciate and encourage my continued growth rather than feeling threatened by it? These are not questions that can be answered quickly or superficially. They require time, observation, and the kind of deep conversation that reveals character rather than merely personality. The prodigal heart that returns does so with the understanding that getting to know another person at this level is itself a sacred art, worthy of patience and attention. There is also the question of timing, not just in terms of finding the right person, but in terms of one's own readiness for the complexities of conscious partnership. The individuation process is not a destination, but a lifelong journey, and there are phases of this journey that are naturally more inward-focused and phases that are more relational. The wisdom lies in recognizing which phase one is in and honoring its requirements rather than forcing premature or inappropriate action. Sometimes the return of the prodigal heart happens gradually, through friendship that slowly deepens into something more intimate. Sometimes it happens suddenly, through an encounter that immediately reveals profound compatibility and mutual recognition. But in either case, the quality that distinguishes conscious partnership from unconscious merger is the continued commitment to individual development alongside shared growth. This commitment requires ongoing vigilance against the natural human tendency to slip back into unconscious patterns when the comfort and security of partnership make such vigilance seem unnecessary. It requires regular check-ins with oneself. Am I maintaining my own center while engaging with this person? Am I projecting onto them qualities they don't actually possess? Am I expecting them to fulfill needs that are ultimately my own responsibility to meet? The paradox of conscious partnership is that it requires each person to remain fundamentally committed to their own wholeness while simultaneously creating space for genuine intimacy and interdependence. This is a delicate balance that cannot be achieved through rules or techniques, but only through the ongoing application of consciousness to the living reality of relationship. Jung spoke of the transcendent function as the psychological capacity to hold opposing forces in creative tension rather than collapsing into one extreme or the other. In conscious partnership, this function is called upon constantly. the tension between autonomy and intimacy, between individual needs and shared goals, between the desire for security and the necessity of growth, between honoring the relationship and honoring the self. The prodigal heart that returns brings this capacity for holding paradox as perhaps its greatest gift to partnership. Having learned to contain the tension between the need for solitude and the longing for connection within their own psyche, they are prepared for the even more complex tensions that arise when two complete beings choose to create something together. But even with all this preparation, all this self-knowledge, all this psychological sophistication, the return to intimate relationship remains an act of faith and courage. There is no guarantee that consciousness will protect us from all hurt, that good intentions will prevent all misunderstanding, that individual wholeness will automatically create relational harmony. Love, even conscious love, remains a mystery that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. This is perhaps the final lesson that the prodigal heart must learn, that consciousness does not eliminate risk, but rather changes our relationship to risk. Instead of avoiding vulnerability out of fear, we learn to embrace it as the price of authentic connection. Instead of seeking guarantees before we open our hearts, we learn to trust our own resilience and wisdom to navigate whatever arises. The return of the prodigal heart is not a return to innocence, but something far more precious, a return to wonder. Having seen the depths of human psychology, having faced the shadow aspects of love and relationship, having learned the hard lessons of projection, and merger and loss of self, the conscious heart returns to partnership with eyes wide open but spirit undaunted. This wonder is not naive. It is informed by experience and tempered by wisdom. It is the wonder of someone who has seen how beautiful love can be when it arises from wholeness rather than neediness, from choice rather than compulsion, from consciousness rather than automatic reaction. It is the wonder of someone who has learned that the greatest gift we can offer another is not our need for them, but our freedom to choose them. In the end, the return of the prodigal heart represents one of the most mature achievements of human psychological development, the capacity to love consciously. It is love that honors both the individual and the relationship, that celebrates both autonomy and intimacy, that seeks both personal fulfillment and shared meaning. It is love that has been tested in the fire of self-knowledge and emerged purified of its unconscious elements. This is the love that becomes possible when we have learned not only why we pull away, but why we might choose to stay. It is the love that can transform relationship from a battleground of competing needs into a sanctuary of mutual recognition and growth. It is the love that the prodigal heart brings home as its greatest treasure, not sought from another, but discovered within and offered freely as a gift to whoever proves worthy to receive it. The journey into withdrawal and back again is thus revealed not as a pathological pattern to be overcome, but as a necessary pilgrimage of the soul. It is the archetypal journey of departure, initiation, and return that mythologies have celebrated since the beginning of human storytelling. It is the hero's journey played out in the intimate theater of the heart, where the treasure gained is nothing less than the capacity to love consciously and to be loved in return for who we truly are. There comes a moment in the soul's long journey when the ancient pattern of withdrawal transforms itself into something entirely new. Not the desperate flight from connection that once defined us, but a conscious choreography of approach and retreat, presence and space, unity and solitude. This is the dance of conscious intimacy, where love learns to breathe. For so long we have known only the extremes, the suffocating merger that drowns the self, or the terrifying isolation that starves the heart. We have lived as pendulums swinging between these polarities, never finding the sacred center where both autonomy and connection can coexist. But here, in this place of hard-won wisdom, we discover that true intimacy is not a destination to be reached, but a rhythm to be danced. The one who once fled from love's approach now understands that withdrawal need not be abandonment, that creating space is not the same as building walls. There is a profound difference between pulling away from fear and choosing distance from wisdom, between running from connection and creating the conditions in which deeper connection becomes possible. This distinction marks the threshold between unconscious reaction and conscious response. In conscious intimacy, we learn that love itself requires both the in-breath and the out-breath, both the coming together and the moving apart. Like the heart that must expand and contract to sustain life, relationship must pulse between union and separation to remain vital. The lovers who seek to remain perpetually merged eventually suffocate in their own closeness, while those who maintain eternal distance starve in their isolation. But consciousness reveals a third way, the dynamic equilibrium of a love that knows when to embrace and when to release. This is not the love of the unconscious, driven by projection and need, seeking in the other what we have not yet found in ourselves. This is not the romantic falling that Jung recognized as a temporary madness, a beautiful delusion that serves its purpose but cannot sustain the weight of real relationship. This is the love that emerges from self-knowledge, the choice made not from emptiness seeking fulfillment, but from fullness offering itself freely. The soul that has learned to dance consciously in intimacy has first learned to be alone without loneliness, to be complete without another's validation, to find in solitude not escape but return. Return to the essential self that exists independent of any relationship, yet enriches every encounter. This is the paradox that confounds the ego. We must become whole to love wholly, must learn to live alone to live well with another. In this dance, each partner maintains their own center while moving in harmony with their beloved. They do not lose themselves in the relationship, nor do they withhold themselves from it. Instead, they bring their full presence to the encounter while preserving the sacred space of their individual becoming. They love from choice, not compulsion. They stay from strength, not weakness. They leave when wisdom calls, not when fear drives. The one who once pulled away from fear now understands that there are times when distance serves love more than proximity. Sometimes the highest form of caring is to step back, to allow the other space to discover what they can only find alone. Sometimes love requires us to resist the temptation to save, to fix, to complete the other, recognizing that each soul must walk its own path toward wholeness. This is the love that does not grasp or cling, that does not seek to possess or be possessed. It is the love that can hold another's pain without trying to heal it, that can witness another's joy without claiming credit for it. It is the love that recognizes in the beloved not a missing piece of oneself, but a complete being whose wholeness calls forth our own. In conscious intimacy, conflict itself becomes part of the dance. The differences that once threatened to tear the relationship apart are now recognized as the creative tension that keeps love alive. We no longer seek to eliminate all friction, understanding that smooth relationships often lack depth, that a love without challenge may be a love without growth. When disagreement arises, we do not immediately retreat to our separate corners or attempt to merge our perspectives into false harmony. Instead, we learn to stay present to the discomfort, to allow our differences to exist without rushing to resolve them. We discover that two people can see the world differently and still love deeply, that perfect understanding is not necessary for profound connection. The dance of conscious intimacy includes moments of exquisite closeness and periods of necessary distance, times of deep sharing and seasons of private reflection. Partners learn to read the subtle signals of each other's needs, when presence is required and when space is sacred, when words are needed and when silence serves. This is not the codependent dance of enmeshment, where boundaries dissolve and identities merge into an undifferentiated mass. Nor is it the independent stance of eternal separateness, where two people live parallel lives that never truly intersect. It is the interdependent rhythm of conscious beings who choose each other again and again, not from need, but from recognition of the unique gift each brings to the encounter. In this sacred dance, each partner becomes both teacher and student, both mirror and mystery. They reflect back to each other the unconscious patterns that still need healing, while respecting the essential mystery that can never be fully known or possessed. They celebrate the familiar while remaining open to surprise, honoring the predictable rhythms of their love while staying available to its infinite capacity for renewal. The soul that has learned this dance no longer approaches relationship as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be lived. They do not seek to master love, but to serve it, not to control their partner, but to honor the autonomous being who has chosen to walk beside them. They understand that true intimacy is not about knowing everything about the other, but about creating a space where the other can know themselves more fully. This is the love that can survive the long, dark nights of the soul, the periods when one or both partners must journey into their own depths to retrieve lost pieces of themselves. It is the love that does not take this inner work personally, that does not interpret the beloved's need for solitude as rejection or abandonment. Instead, it blesses the journey and tends the light that will guide the traveler home. In conscious intimacy, we learn that there are as many ways to love as there are moments in which to express it. Sometimes love looks like presence, sometimes like absence. Sometimes it manifests as fierce attention, sometimes as gentle neglect. Sometimes it appears as passionate engagement, sometimes as peaceful coexistence. The dance of conscious intimacy embraces all these expressions, recognizing that a love limited to one form is a love that has not yet learned to breathe. The partners in this dance develop an exquisite sensitivity to the rhythms of their shared life. They learn to sense when the relationship needs more connection and when it needs more space, when it requires the medicine of togetherness and when it calls for the healing of solitude. They become skilled at reading the subtle energies that flow between them, responding with increasing sophistication to the ever-changing needs of their love. This sensitivity extends to the larger cycles of relationship, the seasons of coming together and growing apart that mark the long journey of shared becoming. They understand that relationships, like all living things, move through phases of expansion and contraction, flowering and dormancy, death and rebirth. They do not panic when their love enters a quiet period, nor do they cling desperately when it begins to transform. In this dance, even endings become sacred. If the time comes when their paths diverge, conscious lovers do not part in bitterness or blame, but with gratitude for what has been shared and blessing for what is to come. They understand that sometimes the highest expression of love is the willingness to let go, to release the other to their own becoming, even when it means walking separate paths. The dance of conscious intimacy is ultimately a spiritual practice, a form of embodied prayer in which two souls honor the divine mystery of love while remaining grounded in the human reality of daily life. It is the marriage of heaven and earth, the union of transcendent vision with immanent care, the integration of mystical understanding with practical wisdom. Those who learn this dance become healers of the ancient wound between masculine and feminine, between autonomy and connection, between the individual journey and the shared path. They demonstrate through their living that it is possible to love without losing oneself, to commit without compromising one's growth, to choose relationship while honoring the call to solitude. Their love becomes a beacon for others who are still caught in the old patterns of pursuit and flight, merger and separation, desperate grasping and fearful withdrawal. They show by example that there is indeed a third way, a path that honors both the need for deep connection and the requirement for individual wholeness. In the dance of conscious intimacy, we discover that the goal was never to eliminate the pull between togetherness and separateness, but to transform our relationship with this eternal tension. We learn to see it not as a problem to be solved, but as the creative force that keeps love alive, the dynamic that prevents relationship from becoming static or stagnant. This is the love that Jung envisioned when he spoke of conscious relationship, not the unconscious falling of romantic projection, but the deliberate choosing that emerges from self-knowledge and genuine care for another's wholeness. It is the love that can sustain the full spectrum of human experience, that does not require perfection from either partner, but instead creates a container strong enough to hold the messy, beautiful, complicated reality of two souls learning to love. In this dance, we finally understand why we once needed to pull away, not because we were incapable of love, but because we were being prepared for a love so conscious, so respectful of both unity and autonomy, that withdrawal and approach could finally find their natural rhythm. We were being taught the steps of the most sacred dance of all, the eternal choreography between two free beings who choose each other not from need, but from the overflowing abundance of their own completion. And in learning this dance, we discover that conscious intimacy is not the end of the journey, but its endless beginning. A practice that deepens with time, a mystery that reveals new dimensions with each turn. A love that grows not by consuming, but by creating, not by possessing, but by setting free, not by completing, but by celebrating the magnificent wholeness that each soul carries as its birthright and its gift to the world. In the deepest chamber of the soul, where all the journeys of withdrawal and return finally converge, lies the ultimate secret that has been waiting patiently through every flight from love, every desperate search for connection, every moment of pulling away and drawing near. It is here, in this sacred inner sanctum, that we discover the truth Jung called the mysterium conjunctionis, the mystical marriage of all our scattered parts into a wholeness so complete that the ancient compulsion to flee from love dissolves like morning mist before the rising sun. This is not another relationship to be navigated or another pattern to be understood. This is the end of all seeking, the resolution of every conflict, the answer to every question the heart has ever asked in its lonely wandering. For in this sacred marriage within, we finally unite with the very love we spent lifetimes searching for in the faces and forms of others, only to discover it was always here, waiting in the most intimate chamber of our own being. The soul that arrives at this threshold has traveled the entire circumference of human longing. It has known the ecstasy of merger and the agony of separation, the sweet intoxication of romantic projection and the bitter awakening of disillusionment. It has pulled away from love 1,000 times and returned 1,000 more, each cycle teaching something essential about the nature of connection and the mystery of the human heart. But now, in this moment of ultimate recognition, we understand why none of those external relationships could ever fully satisfy the deepest hunger of the soul. We were not seeking another person to complete us. We were seeking reunion with the parts of ourselves that had been scattered across the landscape of our unconscious, projected onto lovers and friends, parents and children, teachers and enemies, anyone who could carry for a while the burden of our unlived life. In the sacred marriage within, the masculine principle that lives in every soul, the focused, penetrating, assertive force of consciousness, finally embraces the feminine principle that has always been its perfect complement, the receptive, intuitive, nurturing power of the unconscious. These are not gender roles imposed from without, but archetypal energies that exist in every human heart, regardless of the body's form or the personality's preferences. For too long, these inner partners have lived in conflict, the masculine principle driving us toward achievement and control, while the feminine called us toward surrender and flow. The masculine in us insisted on independence and strength, while the feminine whispered of connection and vulnerability. This inner split created the outer pattern of approach and withdrawal. For how could we commit fully to another when we had not yet made peace with the warring factions within ourselves? But in this sacred marriage, the inner masculine learns that true strength includes the capacity for tenderness, that real independence emerges from the ability to receive as well as give, that genuine power flows not from domination but from the integration of all aspects of the self. The inner feminine discovers that surrender does not mean weakness, that intuition can guide action as surely as logic, that the deepest wisdom often comes wrapped in silence and receptivity. When these archetypal forces finally unite within us, something miraculous occurs. The compulsive quality that characterized all our previous relationships, the desperate need to merge or the terrified impulse to flee, transforms into a natural overflow of wholeness. We no longer approach others from a place of lack-seeking fulfillment, but from abundance-seeking expression. We love not because we need to be completed, but because completion naturally expresses itself as love. This inner marriage also heals the wounded child that lives in every adult heart, the part of us that learned too early that love might abandon us, that connection could become suffocation, that opening our heart meant risking annihilation. In the sacred marriage within, this inner child finally finds the perfect parent it has always sought, not in another person who might disappoint or leave, but in the integrated adult self that can provide both the masculine protection and feminine nurturing that every soul requires. The healed inner child no longer approaches relationship with the unconscious expectations and unmet needs that once drove the pattern of withdrawal. It does not seek in lovers the mother who failed to nurture or the father who could not protect. Instead, it brings to every encounter the wholeness that comes from being perfectly loved by the self that has learned to cherish every aspect of its own being. In this sacred marriage, we also integrate what Jung called the shadow, all the aspects of ourselves we once rejected and projected onto others, the parts of us that seemed too aggressive or too passive, too needy or too independent, too emotional or too rational, finally find their place in the greater symphony of the self. We no longer need to find partners who will carry our unlived potential, for we have claimed every note of our own song. This integration of the shadow is perhaps the most crucial element in resolving the pattern of pulling away, for it was often the encounter with our own rejected aspects in our partners that triggered the impulse to flee. When we saw our own neediness reflected in a lover's eyes, we ran from the mirror rather than embrace the truth it revealed. When we encountered our own capacity for anger or selfishness or weakness in another, we withdrew rather than claim these human qualities as our own. But the soul that has achieved the sacred marriage within no longer needs to run from any aspect of human experience. It has made room for all of it, the light and the dark, the beautiful and the broken, the noble and the petty. This acceptance of our own totality creates a spaciousness that can hold another's full humanity without flinching, without the need to fix or change or escape. The married soul discovers that true intimacy was never about finding someone who matched our idealized image of the perfect partner. It was about becoming so comfortable with our own complexity that we could meet another's complexity with curiosity rather than judgment, with acceptance rather than the need to control. We learn to love the whole person, shadows and light together, because we have learned to love the whole of ourselves. This inner integration also resolves the ancient tension between the need for solitude and the desire for connection that once drove us away from relationship. The soul that has married itself understands that solitude and communion are not opposites but complementary aspects of the same truth. In true solitude, we discover our connection to all life. In genuine communion, we experience our essential solitude more deeply. The integrated being no longer fears losing themselves in relationship because they have found themselves so completely. They do not worry about being consumed by another's needs because they have learned to tend their own emotional fire with such skill that they can offer warmth without being depleted. They do not panic when relationship deepens because they know that no external bond can threaten the indestructible union they have achieved within. From this place of inner wholeness, love becomes not a need to be met, but a gift to be given. We approach relationship not as beggars seeking charity, but as royalty offering treasure. We do not come to take but to share, not to be completed, but to celebrate the completion that has already been achieved in the secret chamber of our own heart. This is the love that Jung envisioned as the highest possibility for human relationship, not the unconscious entanglement of projection and need, but the conscious celebration of two whole beings who recognize in each other the same divine spark that they have discovered in themselves. It is the love that can sustain both unity and separateness because it emerges from a place that transcends the illusion of separation while honoring the reality of individual expression. In this sacred marriage within, we finally understand the deepest purpose of all our relationships. They were not meant to complete us, but to reveal us to ourselves, not to fill our emptiness, but to show us our fullness, not to heal our wounds, but to teach us that wholeness was never lost, only forgotten. Every person who entered our life, every heart that touched ours, every love that ended in withdrawal or transformation was serving this ultimate purpose, preparing us for the moment when we would finally come home to ourselves. The sacred marriage does not eliminate our capacity for human relationship. It transforms it completely. When we no longer need others to make us whole, we can finally see them clearly, without the distortion of projection or the filter of unmet need. When we no longer approach love as a strategy for healing old wounds, we can encounter each moment of connection with fresh eyes and an open heart. This inner wholeness creates a different quality of presence in relationship. We become like tuning forks, resonating with the frequency of love itself rather than the chaotic static of unconscious need. Others feel this difference in our company. They sense that they are not being asked to fill a role or meet an expectation, but are being seen and appreciated for who they truly are. The married soul brings to every relationship the gifts that come from inner union, the masculine clarity that sees truth without judgment, the feminine compassion that holds pain without trying to fix it, the integrated wisdom that knows when to speak and when to be silent, when to approach and when to retreat, when to commit and when to let go. In this state of inner marriage, the old pattern of pulling away finally reveals its deepest secret. We were never running from love. We were running toward it, toward this ultimate love that could only be found in the complete acceptance of ourselves. Every withdrawal was a step on the journey home to this sacred union within. Every moment of resistance to connection was serving the larger purpose of teaching us that the connection we truly sought could only be achieved in the marriage of our own divided self. The soul that achieves this sacred marriage becomes a healing presence in the world. Without trying, without effort or intention, they begin to emanate the frequency of wholeness that calls others home to themselves. Their very existence becomes a reminder that the love we seek is not somewhere out there waiting to be found, but here within us, waiting to be claimed. This is the ultimate transformation of the one who once pulled away from love. They become love itself, not in some grandiose or inflated sense, but in the quiet, profound way that wholeness naturally expresses itself. They no longer need to seek love because they have become it. They no longer need to fear losing love because they are it. They no longer need to run from love because there is nowhere to go. They have arrived at the destination that was always here, waiting in the most intimate chamber of their own heart. And from this place of sacred marriage, they discover that true relationship is not about two incomplete halves trying to make a whole, but about two whole beings celebrating their wholeness together. It is not about losing oneself in another, but about finding oneself more completely in the presence of one who has also found their way home. It is not about the desperate dance of need meeting need, but about the joyful celebration of fullness, overflowing into more fullness, love recognizing itself everywhere it looks, wholeness calling to wholeness across the apparent divide of separate hearts. In the end, we discover that we were never really pulling away from love at all. We were being pulled toward this ultimate love, this sacred marriage within, this union so complete that separation becomes impossible, not because we are trapped, but because we have finally recognized that there was never anywhere to go. We are love. We have always been love. We will always be love. And in this recognition, the ancient wound between self and other, between solitude and connection, between the individual journey and the shared path, heals at last in the golden light of our own eternal wholeness.